Eli's small body shook on the bed, and Mara Sinclair pressed both hands against his burning forehead, trying to hold in a fear that had no place to go. His skin had turned the color of ash. His lips had cracked from the heat pouring out of him. The clock on the wall read 2 in the morning, and the town's only clinic had closed its doors to her 3 hours earlier, the night nurse shrugging behind the glass and telling her there was nothing more they could do until morning. Morning would be too late. Mara knew it the way a mother knows these things, in her chest, in the place where panic lives before the mind catches up. "Mom," Eli whispered, his eyes barely open. "It hurts." "I know, baby. I know." She wrung out the cloth in the bowl of water beside the bed. Water that had been cool 10 minutes ago, and was already turning warm from his fever. Her hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped it. She had tried everything a rational person would try. Fever medicine, cold compresses, a call to the pharmacy, a call to her sister 2 towns over who worked as a nurse, and who told her, voice tight with worry, to get him to a hospital immediately. The nearest hospital was 40 minutes away, and Mara didn't have a car that reliably survived 40 minutes. The transmission had been slipping for a month, and she had been saving for the repair. Saving the way people save when every dollar is already spoken for before it arrives. She thought of calling an ambulance. She had thought of it 3 times already, and each time her hand had hovered over the phone, before she remembered the last bill from urinary issues Eli had 2 winters ago, an emergency room visit that still followed her in collection notices. If she called now, she would go into a debt she could not climb out of, and there was no guarantee they would even understand what was wrong with him. The clinic doctor hadn't understood. He had looked at Eli's chart, looked at his temperature, looked at the strange faint marks that had appeared on the boy's collarbone that morning, small silver lines like frost under the skin, and he had simply written, "Unknown viral presentation," and sent them home with instructions to monitor. Monitor. As if she could do anything else. Eli's breathing hitched, then steadied, then hitched again. Mara leaned close to his ear. "Stay with me. Please stay with me." He murmured something she couldn't understand. His hand found hers and gripped it with a strength that startled her, considering how weak he looked. That was when she remembered what Ruth from the laundromat had told her weeks ago, half as a warning, and half as a rumor passed along like gossip over folded towels. "There's a man who lives out past the old logging road," Ruth had said, dropping her voice like she was afraid the walls might carry it further than the room. "People say he can heal things doctors can't explain. People say you shouldn't go looking for him unless you're desperate, because he doesn't like visitors, and the woods out there don't feel right after dark." At the time, Mara had laughed it off as small-town superstition, the kind of story that grows every time it's told. Now, at 2 in the morning, with her son burning up in front of her, and no working car, and no money, and no answers, superstition sounded like the only door left standing. She wrapped Eli in a blanket, lifted him against her chest, and carried him out into the cold night. He was 8 years old, and too heavy to carry for long, but fear has its own kind of strength, and she found she could carry him farther than she thought possible. The road out of town narrowed after the last streetlight, turning to gravel, then to packed dirt lined with trees that leaned close together overhead, blotting out the stars. Mara had grown up in this town. She knew every street, every shortcut, every neighbor's dog that barked at nothing. She did not know this road. It had always been the road nobody talked about, the boundary line between the world she understood and the forest that belonged to something else, something the old-timers called the Packlands, though nobody ever explained what that meant. Not really. Not in a way she'd taken seriously. She took it seriously now. Eli's breathing rasped against her shoulder. The night around her thickened, the trees standing taller the farther she walked, the silence pressing in from all sides, until even her own footsteps sounded too loud. Somewhere far off, something howled, low and long, and Mara's arms tightened instinctively around her son. "Almost there," she whispered, though she had no idea if that was true. She was speaking to comfort herself as much as him. A shape moved between the trees to her left. She froze, heart slamming, certain for one terrible second that it was an animal. Something with teeth, something that had scented the fear rolling off her in waves. But the shape didn't move again. Maybe it had been a shadow. Maybe it had been nothing at all. She forced her legs to keep walking. The road curved, dipped into a shallow valley, and there, tucked among a stand of old pines, stood a cabin, with a single light glowing in its front window. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, thin and pale against the dark sky. It looked exactly like something out of an old story, the kind meant to scare children into staying close to home, and Mara had never in her life wanted to knock on a stranger's door more than she did in that moment. She climbed the porch steps, Eli's weight pulling at her spine, and pounded on the wood with the side of her fist. "Please," she called out, her voice cracking. "Please, if anyone's home, my son is sick. I need help." For a long moment, nothing happened. The wind moved through the pines, and somewhere behind the cabin, a branch cracked, and Mara's hope began to crumble into something colder. Then the door opened. The man who stood there was tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to see his face fully, and even in the dim porch light, there was something about him that didn't sit quite right with the rest of the world. Something she couldn't name but felt instantly, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. His eyes were a shade of gold that seemed to catch the light strangely, holding it a beat too long before releasing it. He wore a plain dark shirt, sleeves pushed up over forearms that looked like they belonged to someone who worked with his hands, and he studied her, and the boy in her arms, with an intensity that made her want to step back, even as her legs refused to move. "You shouldn't be out here," he said. His voice was low, controlled, careful in a way that suggested he was always careful, always weighing his words before he let them out. "I didn't have a choice." Mara adjusted Eli against her chest, and the boy whimpered, a small broken sound that made the man's gaze snap to him immediately, something shifting in his expression, sharpening. "Please, everyone in town said you might be able to help him. The doctors couldn't. I don't know where else to go." The man was silent for a moment that stretched too long, his eyes moving over Eli's face, his throat, the faint silver marks visible at the collar of his pajama shirt where the blanket had slipped. Something changed in his posture, a stillness that hadn't been there before, alert in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. "Bring him inside," he said finally, and stepped back to let them pass. The cabin's interior was warmer than Mara expected, lit by a low fire and a scattering of oil lamps, the walls lined with shelves that held jars of dried herbs, bundles of roots, and books with cracked leather spines. It smelled of wood smoke and something green and growing, like a garden in the middle of winter. The man cleared a wide wooden table, with one sweep of his arm, and gestured for her to lay Eli down. "My name is Cain," he said, already moving to one of the shelves, selecting jars with quick, practiced hands. "I need you to tell me everything. When did this start? What you've tried. Every detail, even the ones that seem unimportant." Mara talked while he worked, the words spilling out of her in a rush, now that someone was finally listening, finally doing something, instead of shrugging behind a glass window. She told him about the fever that had come on suddenly 2 days ago, about the marks on Eli's collarbone that had appeared that morning, faint at first and then more visible, like frost spreading beneath the surface of his skin. She told him about the clinic, about the medicine that hadn't worked, about the exhaustion in her son's eyes that scared her more than the fever itself. Cain listened without interrupting, his hands never stopping their work, grinding something in a stone bowl, measuring liquid from a dark glass bottle, all while his eyes kept flicking back to Eli's face, to his throat, to the marks Mara still didn't understand. "These marks," Cain said finally, tracing 2 fingers just above Eli's skin without touching it. "How long have you noticed anything like this before? Even faint, even something you dismissed?" Mara hesitated. "There was something last winter. A rash, maybe. It went away in a day and I didn't think about it again." Cain's jaw tightened slightly. "And has he always run warmer than other children? Higher energy at night than during the day? Strange dreams he described in too much detail?" Each question landed like a small stone dropping into a pond Mara hadn't known was there. Ripples of memory she'd never connected before. Eli waking at odd hours, restless, saying he'd dreamed of running through trees on 4 legs. Eli's fevers as a toddler that always spiked after dark and broke by sunrise. She had explained all of it away over the years, the way parents explain away anything that doesn't fit into an ordinary life, because the ordinary explanation is always easier to carry. "Yes," she said slowly. "All of that. What does it mean?" Cain didn't answer right away. He lifted Eli's head gently, tipped a small amount of the mixture he'd prepared past the boy's cracked lips, and watched with an intensity that made Mara's stomach twist. "It means your son is closer to my world than yours," he said at last. "And that world is answering something in his blood that your doctors were never equipped to see." Mara opened her mouth to ask what that meant, what world, what blood, but before she could speak, Eli's back arched suddenly off the table, a soft cry escaping him, and Cain's hand pressed firm and sure against his chest, murmuring words she didn't recognize, low and rhythmic, almost like a song. The fire in the hearth seemed to brighten for a heartbeat, throwing long shadows against the walls, and Mara stood frozen, watching a stranger she had known for less than 10 minutes hold her son's life steady between his hands, terrified and unable to look away, praying to whatever might be listening that this had not been a mistake. The strange chanting went on for several minutes, long enough that Mara's legs began to shake beneath her, and she had to grip the edge of the table to stay standing. Then, gradually, the tension left Eli's small frame. His back settled against the wood. His breathing, which had been shallow and fast, slowed into something deeper, steadier. The angry flush in his cheeks began to fade, replaced by a color that looked almost normal, almost like her son again. Cain stepped back, exhaling slowly, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Mara saw something like relief cross his features. "He'll sleep now," Cain said. "The worst of it has passed." Mara's knees nearly buckled. She caught herself on the edge of the table and looked down at her son, at the color returning to his face, at the steady rise and fall of his chest, and tears she'd been holding back for hours finally broke free. She pressed a hand over her mouth to keep from sobbing out loud, not wanting to wake him, not wanting to disturb whatever fragile peace had settled over the room. "Thank you," she managed. "Thank you. I didn't know where else to go." Cain was quiet for a moment, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something guarded behind those strange gold eyes. "You did the right thing coming here. Another few hours, and this would have gone very differently. What was wrong with him? Please, I need to understand." He hesitated, and Mara could see him deciding how much to tell her, weighing words, the way he'd weighed the herbs in his stone bowl. There are conditions that affect children who carry certain traits in their blood, traits most people never learn they have, because they never come close enough to what triggers them. "Your son's body was reacting to something it couldn't process on its own. I gave him what he needed to process it." "Traits," Mara repeated. "What kind of traits?" "That's a longer conversation," Cain said, "and one better suited to daylight, when your son is well enough to eat something, and you've had a chance to rest." He moved to a cabinet, pulled out a folded blanket, and draped it gently over Eli's sleeping form. "You're both welcome to stay until morning. The road back to town isn't safe to walk again tonight, not with how tired you are." Mara looked at the man standing across the table from her, at the calm competence in every movement he made, at the way his eyes had softened slightly when he looked at her son, and something in her chest loosened, just a little, the first easing of fear she'd felt in hours. "I don't even know how to repay you," she said. "You don't need to repay me for this." His voice carried a firmness that told her the conversation was closed, at least for tonight. "Rest. There's a chair by the fire, and I'll bring you something warm to drink. We can talk more when the sun is up." She sank into the chair he offered, her body finally allowing itself to feel the exhaustion of the entire night, the walk through the dark woods, the terror of nearly losing the only person in the world who mattered to her. She watched Cain move quietly around the cabin, checking on Eli every few minutes, adjusting the blanket, pressing 2 fingers briefly to the boy's wrist to check his pulse, and each time he did, Mara felt a strange mixture of gratitude and curiosity building inside her. Who was this man, living alone out here at the edge of the forest, with jars of herbs that read like something from an old apothecary, and a knowledge of illnesses that no clinic in town had ever heard of? Ruth's warning echoed back to her, softer now, less like a threat and more like an unfinished sentence. He doesn't like visitors. The woods don't feel right after dark. She wondered what else the town knew, or thought it knew, and hadn't told her. Cain returned with 2 mugs of something hot that smelled faintly of mint, and something else she couldn't identify, and he handed one to her, before settling into the chair across from the fire, close enough to watch Eli but far enough to give her space. "You came a long way tonight," he said, his eyes on the flames, rather than on her, as if giving her the privacy to compose herself. "Most people wouldn't have made that walk, not after dark, not with the stories people tell about these woods." "I didn't have a choice," Mara said again, because it was the truest thing she knew. He's all I have. I would have walked twice as far. Something shifted in Kane's expression at that. Something that looked almost like understanding, almost like recognition, of a feeling he knew intimately himself, though he said nothing more about it. Instead, he asked her simple questions. How long she and Eli had lived in town, what she did for work, small ordinary things that felt strange against the backdrop of everything that had just happened, but which slowly, gently, pulled her back from the edge of panic and into something steadier. By the time the fire burned low and her eyelids grew heavy, Mara found herself glancing at Kane with a curiosity that had nothing to do with fear anymore. There were questions circling in her mind, too many to ask that night. Questions about who he really was and why a man with this kind of knowledge chose to live so far from everyone else, hidden away, where only the desperate would find him. But for now, with her son sleeping safely across the room and warmth finally returning to his skin, those questions could wait. She fell asleep in the chair before she meant to, and if she dreamed at all that night, she didn't remember it by morning. What she remembered, when she woke to pale light filtering through the cabin windows, was the sound of Eli's voice, weak but clear, asking for water, and the sight of Kane already awake, watching the boy with an expression of quiet relief that Mara would spend a long time trying to understand. Eli sat up slowly, blinking against the morning light, and looked around the unfamiliar room with the confused expression of a child waking somewhere strange. Then his eyes found Mara, and his face broke into a small, tired smile. "Mom, where are we?" "We're safe," she said, crossing the room quickly to sit beside him, brushing his hair back from his forehead, which was cool now, blessedly cool, none of the burning heat that had terrified her only hours earlier. "You had a bad fever. This is Kane's house. He helped you get better." Eli looked past her to where Kane stood near the hearth, watching the reunion with an expression that seemed almost uncertain, as if he wasn't used to witnessing moments like this, moments of relief and tenderness between a parent and a child. Eli studied him with the open curiosity only children seem to carry without embarrassment. "Are you a doctor?" Eli asked. "Something like that," Kane said, a faint smile touching his mouth, the first real smile Mara had seen from him. "How do you feel?" "Hungry," Eli admitted, and Mara let out a small laugh, half relief and half disbelief, that after everything, her son's first real complaint of the morning was an empty stomach. It was the most normal thing she'd heard him say in 2 days, and it felt like a small miracle. Kane moved to the kitchen area of the cabin, a modest setup with a wood stove and shelves of simple provisions, and within minutes he had a pot warming with something that smelled like broth and herbs. Mara watched him work, noting again how comfortable he seemed with his hands, how deliberate every motion was, nothing wasted, nothing careless. It struck her as strange for a man who was supposed to be some kind of hermit, someone the town spoke of only in hushed and cautious tones. "You said last night that there was more to explain," Mara said quietly, while Eli occupied himself examining one of the jars of dried herbs on a nearby shelf, turning it over in his hands with careful curiosity. "About traits in his blood, about what triggered this." Kane's shoulders tensed slightly, a small movement she might have missed if she hadn't been watching closely. He set a bowl of broth in front of Eli, waited until the boy was occupied with eating, and then guided Mara a few steps away, lowering his voice. "It's not a conversation for young ears," he said. "Not yet, but I promise you, I'll explain everything I can, just not all at once, and not until I'm certain he's fully recovered. His body has been through something significant, and I don't want to risk stressing him further with questions he isn't ready to hear the answers to." "That's fair," Mara said, though the uncertainty gnawed at her. She looked over at Eli, spooning broth into his mouth with the enthusiasm of a boy who had nearly forgotten what hunger felt like, and some of her worry eased at the ordinary sight of it. "But I need to know eventually. He's my son. I need to understand what almost happened to him." "You will," Kane said, and there was something steady and certain in the way he said it, a promise rather than a placation. "I don't make guarantees lightly, Mara. When I tell you something, you can trust it's true." She looked at him then, really looked, taking in the quiet strength in his posture, the careful control in every word he chose, the strange gold of his eyes that seemed to hold more history than a man his age should carry. Whatever secrets lived behind that calm exterior, She sensed they went far deeper than she could imagine, sitting in a cabin, at the edge of the forest, watching her son eat breakfast, as though the previous night's crisis had been nothing more than a bad dream. By mid-morning, Eli was strong enough to walk, though Cain insisted on driving them back into town himself, rather than letting them make the long walk again. His truck was older, well-maintained, parked behind the cabin under a canopy of pine branches that had kept it hidden from the road. As they drove the same path Mara had walked in darkness and terror only hours before, the forest looked entirely different in daylight, ordinary trees and ordinary shadows, nothing that should have frightened her the way it had. Except, she realized, glancing sideways at the man driving them home, some of what she'd sensed in the dark hadn't been imagination at all. There was something about Cain that didn't fit into the ordinary shape of things, something she couldn't name but felt with certainty now, that the panic of the previous night had faded enough to let her think clearly. She thought of the marks on Eli's collarbone. She thought of the strange chant Cain had murmured over her son's shaking body. She thought of Ruth's warning, and the way the whole town seemed to speak of this man only in careful, guarded tones. Whatever Cain was, whatever secret kept him hidden away from the rest of the world, Mara knew with a quiet certainty that this would not be the last time their paths crossed. And as the truck rolled to a stop outside her small house, Eli already chattering happily about wanting to visit the cabin again, some deep and unfamiliar part of her hoped that it wouldn't be. 3 days passed before Mara worked up the courage to return to the cabin, though it wasn't courage exactly that pushed her back down that gravel road. It was Eli, who woke each morning asking when they could visit Cain again, who drew pictures of wolves running through trees, and insisted they were memories rather than imagination, who seemed lighter and more energetic than she had ever seen him, as though whatever illness had gripped him that terrible night had left behind not weakness, but a strange new vitality. She told herself the visit was only to thank Cain properly, to bring him something for his trouble since he had refused money. She packed a basket with bread she had baked that morning, and a jar of preserves from her own kitchen, small offerings that felt inadequate against the weight of what he had done, but it was what she had to give. The drive out felt different this time, less like fleeing into the unknown, and more like returning to something half familiar. Eli sat in the passenger seat of their aging car, which had chosen this week of all weeks to behave itself, chattering about the herbs he remembered seeing on Cain's shelves, and asking if the doctor would teach him their names. Cain was outside the cabin when they arrived, chopping wood with the easy rhythm of someone who had done the task 1,000 times before. He straightened when he heard the car, and Mara caught the flicker of surprise that crossed his face before he composed it into something more neutral, more careful. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon," he said, setting the axe aside, as Eli bounded out of the car ahead of her, full of energy that hadn't been there a few days prior. "I wanted to thank you properly," Mara said, holding out the basket. "And Eli hasn't stopped talking about this place since we left." A small, genuine smile crossed Cain's face as Eli ran up to him, already asking a dozen questions at once about the wood he was cutting, and whether wolves really lived in these woods, and if Cain had ever seen one up close. Cain answered each question with a patience that surprised Mara, crouching to Eli's eye level, letting the boy examine the axe handle, explaining which types of wood burned longest in winter. Watching them together, something warm and unfamiliar stirred in Mara's chest, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in a long time. Eli's father had left before the boy turned 2, and in the years since, it had been only the two of them, learning to navigate the world without anyone else to lean on. Seeing her son so at ease with another adult, so trusting and unguarded, felt like watching a door open that she hadn't realized had been closed. "He's a curious boy," Cain said, straightening as Eli wandered toward the edge of the tree line, drawn by a bird calling somewhere in the branches above. Bright too. Most children his age wouldn't remember half of what he's asking about. "He gets that from his own stubbornness, not from me," Mara said, watching her son with the automatic vigilance of a parent, even here, even in a place that had already proven itself trustworthy in the way that mattered most. "Thank you again. I know I keep saying it, but I don't think you understand what you did for us." "I understand more than you might think," Cain said quietly, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. There was a weight behind the words, a history she couldn't see the edges of yet, and she found herself wanting to ask about it, wanting to peel back whatever layer kept this man so carefully guarded. "Can I ask you something?" she said instead, choosing a gentler path into the conversation. Why do you live all the way out here? Alone, I mean. It can't be an easy life, so far from town. Kane's gaze drifted toward the trees, toward Eli's small figure moving between the trunks, chasing something only he could see. It's easier for me than living among people who don't understand what I am, he said. Out here, I don't have to explain myself to anyone. I don't have to pretend to be something I'm not. And what are you? Mara asked, the question slipping out before she could soften it. He turned to look at her then, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the pines above them, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called out twice before falling silent. Kane's expression shifted through something complicated, weighing how much to reveal, and Mara held her breath, sensing that whatever answer came next would change something between them permanently. Someone who has spent a long time trying to make up for mistakes he can't undo, Kane said finally, his voice quiet enough that she had to lean in slightly to catch every word. That's the honest answer, even if it isn't the one you were hoping for. It wasn't the answer she'd expected, and it raised more questions than it settled, but there was something in the rawness of it that told her not to push further. Not yet. Whatever pain lived behind those words deserved patience, not interrogation. I'm not going anywhere, she said instead, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. If you ever want to explain more, I'll listen, but I won't force it out of you. Something eased in Kane's shoulders, a tension she hadn't realized he was carrying until it loosened. Thank you, he said, and the words carried more weight than such a small phrase should have been able to hold. They spent the rest of the afternoon in easy, unhurried company, Eli darting between them with questions and small discoveries. A beetle he found under a log, a strange-shaped rock, a bird's feather he insisted was magic. Kane answered every question with the same unhurried patience, and Mara found herself laughing more freely than she had in months, watching her son thrive in a place that, only days before, had seemed like the most frightening destination imaginable. As the sun began sinking behind the tree line, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple, Mara realized she had lost track of time entirely, comfortable in a way she hadn't expected to feel, comfortable with a man whose secrets clearly ran deeper than anything he'd shared yet. She gathered Eli, who protested sleepily but didn't fight too hard, and thanked Kane again as they prepared to leave. Come back whenever you like, Kane said, and there was something almost hesitant in the offer, as though he wasn't used to extending it, as though the words themselves were unfamiliar in his mouth. Both of you. Driving back into town with Eli already dozing against the window, Mara found her thoughts circling back to Kane's words. Someone who has spent a long time trying to make up for mistakes he can't undo. She wondered what those mistakes could be, what history had driven a man to isolate himself so completely from the world, hiding away in a cabin at the edge of the forest, where only the desperate came looking for him. Whatever the answer, she found herself wanting to know it, wanting to understand the man who had saved her son's life, and who now seemed to be quietly, carefully, working his way into both of their lives, in ways she hadn't anticipated, and wasn't entirely sure how to stop. That night, after tucking Eli into bed, Mara sat by her window for a long time, looking out at the dark line of trees on the horizon, thinking about gold eyes and careful words, and a loneliness she recognized because she carried a version of it herself. Whatever Kane truly was, whatever world he came from that made him so different from anyone she had ever known, she suspected she was only beginning to understand how deeply their lives had already become tangled together. The following weeks settled into a quiet rhythm that Mara hadn't known she was missing until it arrived. Every few days, she and Eli made the drive out to the cabin, sometimes staying only an hour, sometimes lingering until the stars came out, and Kane insisted on driving them home himself, rather than letting them navigate the dark road alone. Eli's health had returned fully, better than fully, his teachers at school even commenting that he seemed more focused, more energetic than before, and Mara credited it, at least in part, to whatever Kane had given him that first terrifying night. But it wasn't only Eli who seemed changed. Mara noticed it in herself too, small things at first. She found herself smiling more, humming while she cooked, looking forward to the drive out past the old logging road instead of dreading the memory of that first desperate night. Kane, for his part, seemed to soften with each visit, the careful guardedness in his expression easing bit by bit, replaced by something warmer, something that looked almost like happiness, when Eli came barreling toward him with another handful of questions. Yet even as their visits grew more comfortable, Mara noticed the town's reaction sharpening around her. Ruth from the laundromat pulled her aside one afternoon, her voice hushed with a concern that bordered on alarm. "You've been going out to the Ashford place," Ruth said, using a surname Mara hadn't heard before. "People are talking, Mara. That man isn't like the rest of us. You need to be careful." "He saved my son's life," Mara said, more sharply than she intended. "I think I can decide for myself who to trust." Ruth's expression softened, though the worry didn't leave her eyes. "I'm not saying he's dangerous exactly. I'm saying there are things about him nobody in town understands, and the people who do understand don't talk about it. My grandmother used to say the woods out past the logging road belong to something older than this town, something that watches but doesn't interfere, as long as you don't go looking for it. You went looking, Mara. Just be careful what you find." The warning lingered with Mara longer than she wanted to admit, echoing in the quiet moments between errands and Eli's homework and the small routines of daily life. She thought about the strange marks on Eli's collarbone, the marks that Cain had said were connected to traits in his blood he hadn't yet fully explained. She thought about the gold of Cain's eyes, the way they seemed to catch light in ways ordinary eyes didn't. She thought about the careful way he always seemed to be listening for something just beyond hearing, tilting his head slightly toward the tree line, as though following a sound only he could detect. None of it frightened her the way, perhaps, it should have. If anything, it deepened her curiosity, and beneath the curiosity, something else was growing that she wasn't ready to name yet, a warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude, and everything to do with the quiet, careful way Cain looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. On one visit, while Eli occupied himself sorting through a collection of pressed leaves Cain kept in an old wooden box, Mara worked up the nerve to ask the question that had been circling in her mind for days. "The town calls you Ashford," she said. "Is that your real name?" Cain's hands stilled over the herbs he'd been sorting, and for a moment he didn't answer, weighing something behind his careful expression. "It's part of my name," he said finally. "The rest of it belongs to a life I stepped away from a long time ago." "Why did you step away from it?" He set down the herbs entirely now, turning to face her fully, and something in his posture told her this was a conversation he had been avoiding, perhaps even preparing for, uncertain when it would come, but knowing it eventually would. "Because I failed the people who depended on me," he said, his voice quieter than she'd heard it before. "And I couldn't stand to keep failing them by staying in a position I no longer trusted myself to hold. Out here, I only have to answer for myself." That felt safer, for a long time, than answering for anyone else. Mara wanted to ask more, wanted to understand what position he meant, what failure had cut so deep it drove a man into voluntary isolation, but something in his eyes told her he had given her as much as he could manage for now. She let the silence settle instead, comfortable rather than strained, and reached out to rest her hand briefly over his on the table. "Whatever it was," she said, "I don't think it defines you. Not from what I've seen." Cain looked down at her hand covering his, then back up at her face, and something shifted between them in that quiet moment, something neither of them acknowledged aloud but which both seemed to feel settle into place regardless. Across the room, Eli hummed to himself over his box of leaves, oblivious to the small, significant thing happening between the two adults he trusted more than almost anyone else in his young life. It was a beginning, Mara realized, though she couldn't yet name what it was the beginning of. Whatever secrets Cain carried, whatever history had shaped him into the careful, guarded man sitting across from her, she found herself willing to wait for the rest of the story, one quiet visit at a time, one small revealed piece after another, until the whole picture came into view. That evening, as Mara drove them home under a sky just beginning to darken, Eli spoke up from the back seat, his voice thoughtful in the way children's voices sometimes are when they've been turning something over in their minds for a while. "Mom, do you think Cain is lonely?" The question caught her off guard, and she glanced at him in the rearview mirror, surprised by the perceptiveness of it. "What makes you ask that?" Eli shrugged, watching the trees blur past the window. "He looks happy when we're there, but when we leave, he looks sad, like he doesn't want us to go." Mara's chest tightened at the observation, because she had noticed the same thing herself, without quite letting herself acknowledge it. The way Kane's expression shifted as they said their goodbyes each visit, the careful control slipping just enough to reveal something raw underneath, something that looked exactly like loneliness held at bay by sheer will. "I think you might be right," she said softly. "Maybe we should keep visiting, so he doesn't have to be lonely so often." "Good," Eli said, satisfied, and turned back to watching the darkening woods roll past, already planning, in the easy way children plan things, exactly what he wanted to show Kane on their next visit. Mara drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence, her thoughts drifting back to gold eyes and careful hands, and a man who spoke of failure and mistakes he couldn't undo, and she found herself wondering, not for the first time, what exactly waited at the end of the story he still hadn't finished telling her. Whatever it was, she suspected it would change everything she thought she understood about the quiet, gentle man who had pulled her son back from the edge of something terrible, and who now, slowly and carefully, seemed to be pulling her towards something she hadn't expected to find again after all these years alone. Autumn crept over the town in slow, deliberate stages, the leaves turning gold and rust along the roads Mara now knew by heart, the drive to the cabin as familiar to her as the drive to Eli's school. It had been nearly 2 months since that first desperate night, and in that time, the visits had become something neither of them mentioned by name, but both understood as essential, a rhythm neither wanted to break. It was on an ordinary Tuesday evening, golden light slanting low through the pines, that everything shifted again. Mara had brought Eli out after school, and the boy had run ahead toward the cabin the moment the car stopped, eager as always to see what new thing Kane might teach him. But instead of the usual quiet welcome, Mara found the cabin door already open, and voices drifting out into the evening air, low and urgent, unfamiliar. She hurried up the porch steps, fear spiking sharp and sudden in her chest, and found Kane standing near the hearth with 2 others she had never seen before, a tall woman, with sharp eyes and dark hair pulled back severely, and an older man whose weathered face carried an authority that filled the small cabin, without him needing to raise his voice. Eli stood near them, wide-eyed but unafraid, clearly having wandered right into the middle of whatever conversation had been happening. "Mara," Kane said, straightening immediately when he saw her, something protective sharpening in his posture. "This isn't a good time." "I can see that," she said carefully, moving to stand near Eli, one hand settling on his shoulder. "Is everything all right?" The woman with the dark hair studied Mara, with an intensity that felt almost like being measured, weighed, assessed for some quality Mara couldn't guess at. "So this is her," she said, not to Mara but to Kane, as though Mara herself weren't standing right there. "The human you've been protecting." "Nora," Kane said, a warning edge in his voice that Mara had never heard him use before. "That's enough." "Is it?" Nora's gaze didn't leave Mara's face. "Because from where I stand, you've spent 2 months bringing a human woman and her child into territory that was supposed to remain hidden, and now the council is asking questions you don't have good answers for." Mara's pulse quickened, understanding dawning slowly, unpleasantly, that whatever secret Kane had been circling around for months was somehow tied to these strangers, to whatever authority they represented, to a council she had never heard mentioned before. She looked at Kane, searching his face for reassurance, and found instead a tightness in his jaw that told her this conversation had far higher stakes than anything she'd imagined. "Eli," Mara said quietly, crouching slightly to catch her son's attention, "why don't you go look at the herb garden out back for a few minutes? I need to talk to Kane." Eli, sensing the tension in the room even if he didn't understand its source, nodded and slipped quietly out the back door, leaving the 4 adults alone in the cabin's dim, firelit interior. The moment the door closed behind him, Mara turned back to Kane, her voice steadier than she felt. "What is going on? Who are these people? And what territory are they talking about?" The older man spoke before Kane could answer, his voice measured and calm, in a way that somehow felt more unsettling than Nora's sharp edges. "My name is Victor. I serve on the council that oversees matters in this region, matters that extend beyond what most townspeople ever notice or understand. Kane here has responsibilities to that council, responsibilities he has been neglecting for quite some time." "What kind of responsibilities?" Mara asked, though some deep instinct told her she already sensed the shape of the answer, had sensed it since that first night in the dark woods, since the strange marks on Eli's skin, since the gold of Cain's eyes that caught firelight in ways no ordinary eyes should. Cain exhaled slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard from him before, heavy with years of something he'd clearly been avoiding. There are people in this region, Mara, who aren't entirely like you. Families, communities, who carry traits passed down through generations, traits that let them move through the world differently than most humans ever imagined possible. I come from one of those families, a significant one. Significant, Nora repeated, something almost bitter in her tone. That's one word for it. Nora, Victor said, a quiet reprimand that made the woman fall silent, though her sharp eyes never left Mara's face. Mara's mind raced back through everything she had noticed and dismissed over the past 2 months. Every strange detail she had explained away, because the alternative felt too impossible to consider. The way Cain always seemed to hear things before they happened, tilting his head toward sounds she couldn't detect. The way animals in the forest seemed to give the cabin a wide, respectful distance. The strange, low howl she had heard on her very first desperate walk through the dark, a sound she had convinced herself was only wind moving through the trees. You're saying you're not entirely human, she said slowly, testing the words, watching Cain's face for confirmation or denial. He didn't deny it. I'm saying there's more to this world than most people are given the chance to see. And more to your son than either of us fully understood, until his blood reacted to being this close to territory like mine. The pieces clicked together with a force that nearly took Mara's breath away. Eli's fevers that always worsened after dark, the strange marks on his collarbone, the dreams he described of running through trees on 4 legs, dreams he insisted weren't dreams at all. She had noticed every piece and refused, again and again, to see the whole shape they formed together. What is my son? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper now, fear and wonder tangled together in a way she couldn't separate. Someone who carries traits from a bloodline he never knew he had, Cain said gently. It's rare, but it happens. Traits passed down through generations that skip and resurface without warning, sometimes triggered by proximity to others who carry them more strongly. That's what happened that first night. Eli's body was responding to being near my territory for the first time, reacting to a part of himself neither of you understood was there. Victor stepped forward then, his weathered face softening slightly as he studied Mara's stricken expression. I understand this is a great deal to absorb at once. But I want you to understand something else, something important. Cain has broken protocol by allowing you and your son this close to our world without council approval. The council does not take that lightly, not because he did anything to harm you, but because secrecy has protected our communities for generations, and every exception carries risk. Risk to who? Mara asked, protective instinct flaring hot and immediate. My son is not a risk, he's a child. Not a risk from him, Nora said, her voice quieter now, some of the earlier sharpness fading into something more like genuine concern. A risk to him. There are those who don't share our discretion, who see a human family connected to a member of Cain's standing as leverage, as a weakness to exploit. The wider you and your son become known within our world, the more exposed you become to those who wish Cain and his family harm. The warning settled over Mara like a physical weight, and she thought of Ruth's careful words in the laundromat weeks ago. Be careful what you find, and understood now with sudden sickening clarity just how much truth had been buried inside that gentle caution. She looked at Cain, searching his expression for reassurance, and found instead something that looked almost like guilt. I should have told you sooner, he said quietly. I let myself enjoy having you both here without considering what it might cost you both, if the wrong people took notice. But you're telling me now, Mara said, steadying her voice through sheer will. So tell me everything. I need to understand exactly what we've walked into, and exactly what I need to do to keep my son safe. Victor studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind his measured expression. Most humans who learn what you've just learned react with fear, or disbelief, or demand we erase the knowledge from their minds entirely, which is within the council's power, though rarely used, and never without consent. You seem to be reacting with neither. Fear doesn't help my son, Mara said simply. Understanding does. So explain it to me. Cain pulled a chair out for her, and she sat, still aware of Eli's presence just beyond the back door, still aware of how quickly this quiet, ordinary evening had transformed into something that would reshape the rest of their lives. Cain took the seat across from her, and for the first time since she had known him, he seemed to set aside every careful guard he usually wore, letting the full weight of who he was settle visibly into the room. There are families throughout this region, and beyond it, who carry the ability to shift between human form and another, a wolf, though the details of how and why go back further than either of us has time to explain tonight, he said. These families exist in loose communities we call packs, and each pack answers to a hierarchy that keeps order, keeps secrecy, keeps peace between groups who might otherwise clash over territory or resources. I was born into a family that led one of the largest packs in this region. When I came of age, I inherited that leadership. You're saying you're some kind of leader, Mara said slowly. Like Victor and Nora. More than that, Nora said, when Cain hesitated. He's the alpha, the king, if you want the old word for it. The one who holds authority over every pack in this territory, myself and Victor included, whether he's chosen to act like it these past several years or not. The word king settled strangely in the small cabin, at odds with the plain wooden furniture, the jars of dried herbs, the modest simplicity of the life Cain had built for himself out here at the edge of the forest. Mara looked at him with new eyes, trying to reconcile the quiet, careful man who had nursed her son back to health with the image the word conjured, some grand, distant figure of authority and power. Why does a king live alone in a cabin, treating sick children with herbs? She asked. Cain's expression shifted, something old and painful surfacing beneath the careful composure he usually maintained. Because 5 years ago, I failed the people I was supposed to protect, and I have not trusted myself with authority since. The room fell silent. Even Nora, whose sharp edges had softened only slightly since Mara's arrival, seemed to still at the mention of whatever history lay behind those words. Victor's weathered face carried something like sorrow, an old grief revisited. What happened? Mara asked gently, sensing this was ground Cain rarely walked, even in his own mind. There was an attack on our territory, Cain said, his voice low and controlled, in the particular way of someone holding back a great deal of pain through sheer discipline. A rival faction, seeking to expand their own territory at our expense. I was young, confident in my strength, certain I could protect everyone who depended on me. I was wrong. The attack came at night, when I had underestimated the threat, when I had let my guard fall in ways I shouldn't have. I lost people that night. People I loved, people who trusted me to keep them safe, and I failed them. He stopped there, and Mara understood without needing him to elaborate further, that the losses he spoke of ran deeper than the careful, general language suggested, that somewhere in that failure lived a specific and personal grief he wasn't ready to name aloud. Not yet, perhaps not ever fully. After that, Cain continued, I stepped back from leadership. I let the council manage day-to-day matters while I withdrew here, treating the sick, staying useful in small ways I felt I could still be trusted with, without risking anyone's life the way I had before. It seemed safer, for everyone, if I stayed removed from real authority. And the council allowed that? Mara asked, glancing at Victor. We had little choice, Victor said. An alpha who has lost faith in himself is more dangerous in power than out of it. We managed as best we could without him, hoping time would restore what the attack had taken. Instead, he retreated further each year, until visits like tonight's became rare, and concerns like yours became inevitable. Nora's sharp eyes settled on Mara again, though the hostility from earlier had faded into something more contemplative. In 2 months, you and your son have drawn him further out of this isolation than the council has managed in 5 years. That's not nothing. Whatever else this means for the risks involved, it's worth acknowledging. Mara looked at Cain, at the vulnerability still visible in his expression despite his obvious effort to control it, and something in her chest ached at the thought of a man carrying that much guilt alone for so long, hiding away from an entire world of people who depended on him, convinced he no longer deserved the trust they had once placed in him. You're not the same man who made that mistake 5 years ago, she said quietly, not caring that Nora and Victor stood witness to the words. I've seen how careful you are, how much thought you put into every decision, every choice. That's not carelessness. That's someone who learned, the hard way, exactly how much every choice matters. Cain's throat worked as he swallowed, and for a moment, something raw and unguarded passed over his features before he reined it back in, though not entirely. I appreciate that, he said quietly. But good intentions don't undo the past, and they don't guarantee I won't fail again if I step back into that kind of responsibility. Nobody is asking you to step back into it tonight, Victor said, his tone gentler now than it had been at the start of the conversation. But the council does need you to understand the risks your recent choices have created, for yourself, and now for this family as well. Word travels, even in territories as careful as ours. If rival factions learn that the Alpha King has formed an attachment to a human family, they may see opportunity in that knowledge. The word attachment hung in the air, and Mara felt her face warm despite the seriousness of everything else being discussed. She glanced at Kane and found him watching her, with an expression that confirmed the word wasn't entirely inaccurate, whatever careful distance either of them had maintained until now. What do you suggest we do? Mara asked, forcing her attention back to the practical matter at hand, the safety of her son weighing far heavier than any complicated feelings stirring beneath the surface of this conversation. Discretion, Nora said. Fewer visits, at least for now, until we understand how much attention this situation has already drawn, and Kane needs to consider, seriously, whether the isolation he's chosen is still serving anyone, including himself, or whether it's simply become a habit he's afraid to break. Kane's jaw tightened at the direct challenge, but he didn't argue the point, which told Mara more than any words could have about how deeply Nora's observation had landed. The fire in the hearth had burned low while they talked, and outside, the evening had deepened into full darkness, the kind that had frightened her so completely on her first desperate walk to this cabin months ago. Now, sitting in the firelight with the truth finally laid bare between them, Mara felt something different than fear. She felt the weight of a decision approaching, one that would ask more of her than she had ever been asked before, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she wasn't ready to walk away from it. The back door creaked, and Eli poked his head back into the cabin, having grown restless waiting in the garden, his curiosity finally overriding his patience. "Is it okay to come in now?" he asked, glancing between the four adults with the particular perceptiveness of a child who senses something important has happened, even without understanding exactly what. "Of course," Kane said, his voice shifting instantly into something warmer, more familiar, the careful authority of moments, before folding back beneath the gentleness Eli knew from their many visits together. "Come here. I want you to meet some people." Eli approached cautiously, studying Nora and Victor with wide, assessing eyes. Nora, whose sharpness had seemed almost frightening to Mara only minutes before, crouched down to the boy's level with a gentleness that surprised her, some hard edge in her expression softening entirely in the presence of the child. "You must be Eli," she said. "Kane has told the council about you, said you're braver than most children twice your age." Eli beamed at the praise, glancing quickly at Kane for confirmation, who nodded solemnly, and Mara watched the exchange with a strange, aching tenderness, understanding now how much these visits had meant to Kane, beyond simply healing a sick child, how much Eli's easy trust and open affection had begun to heal something in Kane himself that had been broken for 5 long years. Victor watched the boy for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable, before he spoke again, this time directing his words to Mara rather than the group at large. "The council will need to discuss what's happened here tonight, and what precautions need to be taken going forward. But I want you to know, whatever caution we've urged, none of it comes from doubting your character, or your son's. It comes only from wanting to protect you both from dangers you don't yet fully understand." "I appreciate that," Mara said, and meant it, even as unease settled deep in her stomach at the word dangers, spoken so plainly, so seriously, by a man who clearly understood exactly what those dangers looked like in practice. Nora rose from her crouch beside Eli, studying Mara one final time with an expression that had shifted, somewhere in the last hour, from suspicion into something closer to grudging respect. "For what it's worth," she said, "I've known Kane a long time. I haven't seen him this present, this engaged with anything, since before the attack. Whatever risk you've brought into his life, you've also brought something back that we all thought might be gone for good." The words settled warmly in Mara's chest, even as the weight of everything else discussed tonight pressed down alongside them. She glanced at Kane, and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't fully name, gratitude tangled with something deeper, something neither of them had spoken aloud, but which both, she suspected, had begun to feel growing steadily between them over these past 2 months. Victor and Nora took their leave shortly after, disappearing into the darkness beyond the cabin's porch light, with a quiet efficiency that made Mara wonder exactly how they had arrived in the first place, since she hadn't noticed any vehicle parked outside. She decided not to ask, some instinct telling her the answer would only raise further questions she wasn't ready to absorb tonight. Once they were gone, the cabin felt smaller somehow, quieter, just the three of them again in the familiar warmth of the firelight. Eli had already wandered back to his box of pressed leaves, humming contentedly to himself, blessedly unaware of how significantly the evening's conversation had reshaped the adults around him. "I'm sorry you had to learn everything this way," Kane said quietly, moving to stand beside Mara near the window, both of them watching Eli's small, absorbed form across the room. "I wanted to tell you myself, in my own time, not have it forced into the open by council business." "I understand why you waited," Mara said. "It's not an easy thing to explain, and I imagine it's even harder to trust someone with, especially after everything you told me about what happened 5 years ago." Kane was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a vulnerability she hadn't heard from him before, not even in their most honest conversations over the past 2 months. "I trust you, Mara, more than I've trusted anyone since the attack. That frightens me more than anything Nora or Victor said tonight." The admission hung between them, honest and unguarded, and Mara felt something settle into place inside her chest, some quiet certainty she hadn't let herself acknowledge until this exact moment. Whatever risks lay ahead, whatever dangers the wider world Kane belonged to might bring into her carefully ordinary life, she found she wasn't willing to walk away from what had begun growing here, in this small cabin at the edge of the forest, between a mother desperate to save her son, and a king hiding from his own broken heart. "Then let's face whatever comes next together," she said, and reached for his hand, and felt him hold on tightly, as though she had offered him something he hadn't realized he still needed permission to want. Word travels strangely in small towns, sliding sideways through conversations rather than arriving directly, and within a week of the council's visit to Kane's cabin, Mara began noticing subtle shifts in how people treated her. Not hostility exactly, but a wary curiosity, glances that lingered a beat too long at the grocery store, whispered conversations that fell silent when she approached. Ruth, who had warned her weeks earlier, now watched her with something closer to worried resignation than surprise, as though she had expected this outcome all along and simply hoped it wouldn't arrive so quickly. "People know you've been spending time with him," Ruth said one afternoon, folding towels with more force than the task required. "Not the details, not really, but enough to talk." "Let them talk," Mara said, though the words carried less confidence than she wanted them to. "He's a good man, Ruth. Whatever the town thinks it knows about him, they're wrong." Ruth studied her for a long moment, something complicated behind her eyes. "I believe you," she said finally. "I've seen the way your boy lights up whenever his name comes up. Children don't fake that kind of trust. But good men can still be dangerous, Mara. Not because of what's in their hearts, but because of what follows them." The warning settled uneasily, alongside everything Victor and Nora had said that night in the cabin, about rival factions and exposed risks and dangers Mara didn't yet fully understand. She thought about it often in the weeks that followed, turning the words over during quiet moments, watching Eli play in the yard, wondering what shape those dangers might eventually take, and whether she would recognize them in time. Despite the growing unease, the visits to the cabin continued, though with more caution now, spaced further apart, timed to avoid drawing extra attention. Kane, for his part, seemed to be wrestling with something internal since that difficult conversation with the council, a restlessness Mara hadn't seen in him before, as though Nora's blunt challenge about his years of isolation had cracked something open that he hadn't yet decided how to handle. "I've been thinking about what Nora said," he admitted one evening, while Eli slept curled on the cabin's worn couch, exhausted from an afternoon spent learning to identify different types of bark from the trees surrounding the property. "About whether staying hidden out here is still serving anyone." "And what have you decided?" Mara asked, settling into the chair across from him, the fire casting warm light across both their faces. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "For 5 years, this has felt like the only responsible choice, the only way to keep from repeating the same mistakes. But lately, it feels less like responsibility, and more like hiding. I'm not sure when that shift happened. Mara considered her words carefully before speaking, aware of how much weight her response might carry, how much Kane seemed to value her perspective, even on matters that reached far beyond her own understanding of his world. I think, she said slowly, that grief and responsibility can look identical from the inside, even when they're different things entirely. Maybe what started as responsibility became grief you didn't know how to put down. Kane's eyes met hers across the firelit room, something raw and grateful passing behind his careful expression. That's exactly what it feels like, he said quietly. I hadn't found the words for it myself. You don't have to figure it all out tonight, she said, reaching across the small distance between their chairs to rest her hand over his. Whatever you decide, about the pack, about your place in all of it, I'll still be here. The simple promise seemed to land with more weight than she'd intended, and Kane turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers together in a gesture that felt both new and somehow inevitable, as though this had always been where their careful, cautious months of friendship had been leading. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, content in the quiet, firelit intimacy of the cabin, Eli's soft breathing, the only sound beyond the crackle of burning wood. It was in this fragile, tender space that Mara allowed herself, for the first time, to consider what it might mean to build a real future here, tangled together with a man from a world so different from her own, a king in hiding, a mother rebuilding trust one careful step at a time. The thought frightened her slightly, not because of Kane himself, but because of everything Victor and Nora had warned about, the dangers that followed a man of his standing, dangers that could reach into her ordinary life and Eli's, and reshape them in ways she couldn't yet predict. But sitting there, hand in hand with a man who had saved her son and slowly, carefully, begun stitching himself into the fabric of both their lives, Mara found the fear easier to set aside than she expected. Whatever came next, she decided, she would face it the way she had faced that first desperate night in the dark woods, walking forward without knowing exactly what waited on the other side, trusting that the risk was worth whatever they might find together. Later, as she carried a sleepy Eli out to the car, and Kane walked beside them under a sky thick with stars, the boy stirred just enough to mumble something that made both adults smile despite the seriousness of everything weighing on their minds. Can Kane come to my birthday party next month? Eli asked, eyes still closed, already half returned to sleep. Mara glanced at Kane over her son's head and found him watching the boy with an expression of such open tenderness that her breath caught slightly in her chest. I don't see why not, she said softly, if he wants to. I would like that very much, Kane said, his voice carrying a warmth that told Mara he meant it more deeply than the simple words suggested, that an invitation to something as ordinary as a child's birthday party carried more significance for a man who had spent 5 years convincing himself he deserved no place in anyone's ordinary happiness. As she settled Eli into his car seat and prepared to drive home, Mara allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine what their lives might look like if all the careful caution and quiet fear could someday fall away entirely, if Kane could someday stand fully in the light of both their worlds, instead of hiding at the edges of each. It felt like a fragile hope, easily shattered by everything still unresolved and unknown, but she held on to it anyway, driving home under a sky full of stars, already looking forward to the next quiet evening at the cabin in the woods. Not everyone in Kane's world greeted the news of his growing attachment with the same cautious warmth Nora and Victor had eventually extended. Word of an alpha king forming a bond with a human family spread through the wider network of packs, faster than either Kane or the council anticipated, carried along old channels of communication that existed far beyond the town's borders, whispered between territories that had watched Kane's isolation for years, with varying degrees of concern and calculation. Among those listening closely was a faction from the Eastern Territories, packs who had never fully accepted the boundaries drawn after the attack 5 years earlier, who saw in Kane's continued absence from full leadership an opportunity they had been patiently waiting to exploit. News of a vulnerability, a human woman and child that the Alpha King had grown attached to, traveled through their ranks like a spark finding dry kindling, and in a meeting held far from Mara's quiet, unsuspecting town, plans began quietly taking shape. Mara knew nothing of this, of course, living her ordinary days unaware of the currents moving beneath the surface of the world she had only recently glimpsed. She continued working her shifts at the diner in town, continued picking Eli up from school and helping with homework and packing lunches, continued the small, steady rhythms of a single mother's life, all while carrying inside her the growing, tender knowledge of what had begun blooming between herself and Cain. Eli's birthday arrived on a crisp Saturday in late autumn, and true to his word, Cain appeared at the small gathering Mara had arranged in her modest backyard, bringing with him a gift that made Eli's eyes go wide with delight: a hand-carved wooden wolf, detailed down to the texture of its fur, clearly the product of many careful hours of work. "Did you make this?" Eli asked, turning the carving over in his hands with the reverence children reserve for gifts they instinctively understand carry more meaning than store-bought toys ever could. "I did," Cain said, crouching to the boy's level. "I thought you should have something that reminds you of the parts of yourself you're still learning about, something to hold on to, even on the days it feels confusing." Eli threw his arms around Cain's neck in a spontaneous hug that caught the man visibly off guard, and Mara, watching from a few feet away, felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes at the sight of her son embracing this careful, guarded man so completely and unreservedly. Cain's arms came up slowly, almost hesitantly, around the boy's small frame, as though he wasn't entirely certain he was allowed this kind of uncomplicated affection, as though 5 years of self-imposed distance had left him unsure how to simply receive love, without questioning whether he deserved it. The other guests at the party, a handful of Eli's schoolmates and their parents, watched the exchange with polite curiosity, none of them aware of the significance behind the carved wolf, or the tension that had passed through Cain's expression, before settling into something soft and unguarded. To them, he was simply Mara's quiet friend, a tall man with an unusual intensity to his gaze, nothing more remarkable than that. Later, after the other families had gone home and Eli had fallen asleep clutching his new wooden wolf, Mara and Cain sat together on her back porch, the evening cool and clear around them, stars beginning to emerge overhead. "Thank you for today," she said. "I don't think you understand what it meant to him, having you there." "I think I understand better than you realize," Cain said quietly. "It meant just as much to me." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind that had grown easier between them over these past months, before Cain spoke again, his voice carrying a hesitance Mara had rarely heard from him. "I want you to know," he said, "that whatever risks come from this, from us, I don't regret a single moment of it, even knowing what it might cost." Something in the way he said it, the careful weight behind the words, sent a small thread of unease through Mara's chest, cutting through the warmth of the evening. "What do you mean, what it might cost?" Cain hesitated, clearly debating how much to share, before deciding, as he so often did with her now, on honesty over careful omission. "There have been whispers, from territories beyond our own, about my connection to you and Eli. Nothing confirmed, nothing the council considers an immediate threat. But I want you to be aware, so that if anything ever feels wrong, anything at all, you trust that instinct and reach out to me immediately." The unease deepened into something closer to fear, though Mara worked to keep her voice steady, unwilling to let the fragile peace of the evening crack entirely. "Should I be worried?" "I don't want you to live in fear," Cain said, reaching over to take her hand in the darkness. "But I do want you prepared. The world I come from isn't always as gentle as the moments we've shared these past months. I intend to keep you and Eli safe from whatever ugliness might exist in it. I only need you to trust me if the time comes that I ask you to be careful." "I trust you," Mara said, and meant it completely. Even as the shadow of his warning settled over the rest of the evening, a quiet reminder that whatever tender thing had grown between them existed alongside dangers she still couldn't fully see the shape of, dangers that, unbeknownst to either of them, had already begun moving quietly closer. In the weeks that followed the birthday party, Mara noticed small changes in Cain that told her he had begun taking his own warning seriously, even if he hadn't said so directly. He started making trips into the wider pack territories again, brief absences he explained only as council matters, returning each time a little more tired, a little more burdened, but never willing to share the full weight of what those meetings involved. She didn't press him for details he clearly wasn't ready to share, understanding by now that Cain revealed his world to her in careful, deliberate pieces, trusting her with only as much as he believed she could safely carry. Instead, she focused on what remained steady and good between them: the quiet evenings at the cabin, Eli's growing confidence in a part of himself he was only beginning to understand, The slow, careful way affection had grown into something neither of them bothered denying any longer. One evening, as Cain walked her and Eli to their car, after another long day, he paused before opening the driver's door, something serious settling over his features. "I need to travel further east for a few days," he said. "Council business that can't wait. I'll have someone check on you both while I'm gone," quietly, without drawing attention. "Is this about what you mentioned before? The whispers?" Cain's jaw tightened slightly, confirmation enough even without words. "I don't want to alarm you, but I'd rather be overly cautious than dismiss something that could put either of you at risk." Mara studied his face in the porch light, searching for the fear she expected to find there, and finding instead only quiet determination, the look of a man preparing to protect what mattered to him no matter the cost. Whatever guilt and grief had kept him hidden away these past 5 years, she realized, watching him now, none of it had diminished the fierce, protective strength that clearly lived at his core, waiting patiently for the moment it would be needed again. "Be careful," she said softly, reaching up to press her palm against his cheek. "Whatever happens out there, come back to us." "Always," Cain said, and the certainty in that single word carried her through the uneasy nights that followed, even as the shadow of whatever threat gathered beyond her understanding, drew slowly, steadily closer to the quiet life she had built with her son. The days Cain spent away felt longer than Mara expected, the cabin's absence from her routine leaving a strange, hollow quiet in evenings that had grown accustomed to his steady presence. She kept herself busy with work and Eli's school routines, told herself the unease settling in her stomach was simple worry over Cain's safety, nothing more. But on the third afternoon of his absence, something happened that sharpened that unease into something closer to genuine alarm. She had arrived at Eli's school to pick him up, joining the familiar cluster of parents waiting near the front entrance, when she noticed a man standing across the street, leaning against a parked car, with a stillness that felt deliberately out of place among the ordinary bustle of dismissal time. He wore plain clothes, nothing remarkable in itself, but something about the way he watched the school entrance, patient and unblinking, sent a cold thread of instinct through Mara's chest. She told herself it was nothing, a father waiting for his own child perhaps, or simply a stranger passing through town. But when Eli emerged from the building and ran toward her, backpack bouncing, the man's gaze shifted, tracking her son's movement, with an attention that felt far too focused for casual curiosity. Mara scooped Eli into a quick hug, using the motion to glance back across the street, and found the man's eyes had settled directly on her now, something calculating in his expression before he turned unhurriedly and climbed into the car, pulling away without any evident urgency, as though he had gathered exactly what he came for and felt no need to rush. "Mom, you're squeezing too hard," Eli complained, and Mara forced herself to loosen her grip, forced her voice into something light and unconcerned, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "Sorry, buddy. Just happy to see you." She drove home taking a longer route than usual, checking the rearview mirror far more often than the drive required, relief flooding through her only once they were safely inside the house with the doors locked behind them. She thought immediately of Cain's warning, "Be careful, trust that instinct," and reached for her phone with hands that trembled slightly. Cain answered on the second ring, his voice sharpening with concern the moment he heard the tightness in hers. She described the man as clearly as she could, the stillness of his posture, the way his attention had tracked Eli's every movement, the unhurried way he had left once he seemed satisfied with whatever he had observed. "I'm coming back tonight," Cain said, no hesitation in his voice at all. "Don't leave the house until I arrive. Keep the doors locked, and if you see anything unusual, anything at all, call me immediately." "Cain, what's happening? Is this the threat you mentioned before?" There was a pause on the line, brief but telling. "I believe so. I'm sorry, Mara. I hoped we had more time before this reached you directly." The hours until Cain's return stretched long and tense, Mara keeping Eli occupied with dinner and homework, while her attention remained divided, ears straining for any unfamiliar sound outside, eyes drifting repeatedly to the windows despite the drawn curtains. Eli, sensing his mother's distraction even without understanding its cause, grew quieter than usual, picking up on the tension the way children so often do, absorbing it even when adults try their best to shield them from it. "Are we in trouble?" Eli asked eventually, pushing his dinner around his plate rather than eating it. Mara knelt beside his chair, taking his small hands in hers, choosing her words with the same careful deliberation Cain so often used with difficult truths. "There are some people who might not understand our friendship with Cain the way we do," she said, "but Cain is very strong and very smart, and he's not going to let anything happen to either of us. I need you to trust that, just like I do." Eli studied her face for a long moment with the serious, searching expression he sometimes wore, an expression far older than his 8 years. "Cain wouldn't let anything bad happen," he said finally, with the simple, absolute certainty children reserve for the people they trust completely. "He saved me before, he'll do it again." The confidence in her son's voice steadied something in Mara's own chest, and she pulled him into a hug, grateful beyond words for his resilience, even as she prayed silently that his trust in Cain's protection would prove as solid as he believed it to be. Cain arrived just past 9 that evening, his expression tight with barely restrained tension, as Mara led him inside and locked the door firmly behind him. He crossed immediately to where Eli sat on the couch, crouching to check on the boy with the same careful attention he'd shown that very first desperate night months ago, before turning his focus fully to Mara. "Tell me everything again," he said, "every detail you remember." She recounted the encounter as precisely as she could, watching Cain's expression darken with each detail, his jaw tightening at the description of how the stranger's attention had followed Eli's movement across the schoolyard. "This matches what I feared," Cain said finally, running a hand through his hair, an unusually agitated gesture for a man who typically maintained such careful composure. "The Eastern faction I mentioned. They've clearly moved from gathering information to active surveillance. This changes things significantly." "What do we do?" Mara asked, fear and determination warring in equal measure in her voice. Cain looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and protective settling into his expression. The careful, gentle man she had grown to love giving way, just slightly, to something harder underneath, something that carried the unmistakable weight of authority he had spent 5 years trying to set aside. "We do whatever it takes to keep you both safe," he said, "even if that means I can no longer stay hidden away out here, pretending the world I left behind doesn't need me anymore." That night, after Eli had finally fallen asleep in his own bed, guarded by a lock on his window Cain had checked twice, Mara and Cain sat together at her kitchen table, a single lamp casting warm light over the serious conversation unfolding between them. "Explain it to me properly," Mara said. "All of it. Who is this faction, and why would they want to hurt a child?" Cain exhaled slowly, gathering his thoughts before answering. "The Eastern Territories have always chafed under the boundaries the Council established after the attack 5 years ago. Their leadership believes those boundaries favor packs like mine unfairly, and they've spent years looking for opportunities to challenge that arrangement, either through negotiation or through force, depending on which leader holds power among them at any given time. And they see me and Eli as an opportunity." "They see you as leverage," Cain said, his voice hardening with barely contained anger at the thought. "If they can threaten someone I care about, they believe they can force concessions from the Council, weaken my standing, perhaps even provoke a conflict that destabilizes the current balance of power, enough for them to seize territory they've wanted for years. It's a calculated, cold strategy, and it's exactly the kind of thing I should have anticipated the moment I let myself grow close to you both." "Don't," Mara said firmly, reaching across the table to still his restless hands. "Don't you dare blame yourself for caring about us. That's not weakness, Cain. Whatever they're trying to exploit, the fault lies with them, not with you for loving your family." The word family hung in the air between them, unplanned but entirely honest, and Cain's eyes lifted to meet hers, something raw and grateful flickering across his features, despite the seriousness of the danger they were discussing. "Family," he repeated softly, as though testing the shape of the word in his mouth. "I haven't let myself think of it in those terms in a very long time." "Well, start," Mara said, her voice gentle but resolute, "because that's exactly what we've become, whether either of us planned it or not, and I intend to fight for it, just as hard as I know you will." Cain's expression shifted into something fierce and determined, the careful, guarded man giving way further to the leader Nora and Victor had described that night in the cabin, a man capable of holding authority over an entire territory, now channeling that same strength toward protecting the small, ordinary family that had somehow become the most important thing in his carefully rebuilt life. "I need to call an emergency council session," he said. "If the Eastern faction has moved to active surveillance, the entire territory needs to be alerted, and I need to formally reclaim full authority over our packs to coordinate a proper response. I can't do this halfway anymore. Not with your safety, and Eli's on the line." "Will that put you in more danger?" Mara asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. "Likely," Kane admitted honestly. "Stepping back into full leadership makes me a clearer target than I've been these past 5 years, but staying in hiding puts you and Eli in danger without giving either of us the resources to properly protect you. I'd rather face that risk directly than continue pretending I can keep everyone safe by staying small." Mara studied his face in the lamplight, seeing clearly now the toll 5 years of guilt and self-imposed exile had taken on him, and beneath that toll, something resilient and strong that had never actually left, only waited patiently for a reason, significant enough to draw it back out. She thought of Eli's simple, unwavering trust. "He saved me before, he'll do it again," and found herself believing it with the same absolute certainty her son carried. "Then do it," she said. "Reclaim what's yours. Whatever it takes to keep our family safe, I trust you to make the right choices, Kane. I've trusted you since that very first night, and nothing that's happened since has given me reason to doubt that." Something settled in Kane's expression at her words, resolve hardening into certainty, and he reached across the table to take her hand, holding it with a firmness that spoke louder than any promise he could have voiced aloud. Outside, the night pressed close against the windows, holding whatever dangers still gathered beyond their sight. But inside the small kitchen, lit by a single warm lamp, Mara felt something steady and unshakable settle into place between them. A partnership forged not despite the danger circling closer, but strengthened by their shared determination to face it together. "I'll need to leave again tomorrow," Kane said quietly, "to formally reconvene the council and begin coordinating protection for you both. But I won't leave you unguarded, not for a moment. I'll arrange for someone trustworthy to stay near the house while I'm working to secure things on a wider scale." "Who?" Mara asked. "Nora," Kane said, a small, tired smile crossing his face despite everything. "Beneath all that sharpness, she's one of the most fiercely loyal people I know. She'll keep you and Eli safe, as though you were her own family, whether she admits to caring that much or not." Mara found herself smiling, despite the tension still coiled tight in her chest, remembering the way Nora had softened so unexpectedly in Eli's presence that first difficult night in the cabin. "I think I'd like that," she said, having her nearby. They sat together a while longer, discussing practical details, security measures for the house, a code word Eli could use if he ever felt genuinely afraid, small steps to build a fragile sense of safety around the uncertainty that had suddenly overtaken their quiet lives. By the time Kane finally rose to leave, promising to return before Nora's arrival the following morning, something had shifted permanently between them. A line crossed from careful courtship into something deeper, a partnership bound not only by affection, but by shared purpose, shared responsibility, and a fierce, mutual determination to protect the small, precious family they had built together against whatever darkness threatened to tear it apart. Nora arrived early the next morning, slipping into the quiet routine of Mara's household with a competence that immediately put Mara at ease, despite the sharp edges she remembered from their first meeting. She walked the perimeter of the house methodically before coming inside, checking window locks, studying sightlines from the street, moving with the efficient precision of someone who had done this kind of protective work many times before. "Nice place," Nora said, accepting a cup of coffee from Mara with a small, genuine smile that softened her sharp features considerably. "Small enough to secure properly. That's good. I appreciate you doing this," Mara said. "I know it's asking a lot." Nora waved the gratitude away with a practical shrug. Kane asked, "That's enough for me. Besides," she added, glancing toward the hallway where Eli's voice drifted from his room, already chattering happily about something to his stuffed animals, "I meant what I said before. That boy is worth protecting." Over the following days, Nora settled into an unobtrusive but constant presence, watching the house during school hours, walking Eli to and from the bus stop with a casual friendliness that drew no unwanted attention, teaching Mara small practical measures to notice anything unusual in her surroundings. Beneath her sharp exterior, Mara discovered a woman fiercely dedicated to protecting those she'd decided were worth protecting, and somewhere in those tense, careful days, an unexpected friendship began forming between them. "You're not what I expected," Nora admitted one evening, the two of them sitting on the porch after Eli had gone to bed, watching the quiet street for anything out of place. "When Kane first told the council about you, I assumed the worst. A human woman getting too close to something she couldn't understand, putting everyone at risk for reasons that wouldn't hold up under real pressure. And now?" Mara asked. "Now I think you might be exactly what he needed," Nora said, her voice quieter than usual, more thoughtful. "He's been half a person these past 5 years, going through the motions of living without actually living. I haven't seen him fight for something the way he's fighting for you and your son. Whatever else this brings, that alone is worth something." Mara absorbed the words with quiet gratitude, understanding better now the depth of loyalty that bound Kane's inner circle to him, loyalty that had waited patiently through years of his self-imposed exile, ready to rally the moment he showed any sign of reclaiming the strength they all remembered him carrying before tragedy hollowed it out. Meanwhile, reports filtering back from Kane's council sessions painted an increasingly concerning picture. The Eastern faction's surveillance had expanded beyond the single incident at Eli's school, sightings of unfamiliar figures near the edges of Kane's territory, growing more frequent, more brazen, as though testing how quickly the council would respond, gauging exactly how much resolve remained behind the boundaries that had held for 5 relatively peaceful years. Kane called each evening, his voice growing more strained with each passing day, though he remained careful never to let that strain color the tenderness he reserved for his conversations with Eli, who insisted on speaking to him briefly every night before bed, updating him on small details of his day, with the earnest seriousness only children bring to such rituals. "When are you coming back?" Eli asked one evening, phone pressed close to his ear, Mara watching from the doorway with an ache in her chest, at the loneliness evident in her son's voice. "Soon, I hope," Kane's voice carried faintly through the speaker. "I'm working very hard to make sure our home stays safe, so I can come back and stay for good this time. Can you be patient a little longer for me?" "I can be patient," Eli said solemnly, though his small shoulders drooped slightly at the answer. "But hurry, okay? I miss you." "I miss you too," Kane said, and Mara heard the genuine ache behind the words, the cost of separation weighing on him as heavily as it weighed on her son, perhaps more heavily, given everything he carried alone in those distant council chambers, fighting a battle neither she nor Eli could fully witness or understand. After Eli finally drifted to sleep that night, exhausted from the accumulated tension of the past several days, Mara sat alone on her porch, Nora having stepped away briefly to check the perimeter one final time, before settling in for the night watch. She looked out at the dark, quiet street, thinking of Kane, somewhere beyond her sight, fighting to reclaim authority he had spent 5 years believing himself unworthy of holding, all in the name of protecting a family that had only entered his life a few short months ago, but had already become, unmistakably, the center of everything he fought for. Whatever came next, she realized, sitting alone beneath a sky, just beginning to cloud over with the promise of an early winter storm, there was no turning back from the path they had chosen together. The quiet, ordinary life she had built alone with Eli had irrevocably transformed into something larger, more dangerous, but also, she suspected, something far more meaningful than anything she could have found on her own. And as the first cold drops of rain began falling softly against the porch roof, Mara found herself praying, not for safety alone, but for the strength to face whatever storm, literal or otherwise, still gathered on the horizon, waiting to test everything she and Kane had built together. The storm rolled through overnight, rain hammering steadily against the roof, and by morning, the world outside had transformed into a gray, dripping landscape that matched the tension still coiled tight in Mara's chest. She kept Eli home from school that day, an instinct she couldn't fully explain, but which Nora, arriving early and soaked from the rain, endorsed without hesitation. "Trust your instincts," Nora said, shaking water from her jacket at the door. "They're often sharper than we give them credit for, especially when it comes to protecting your own." The day passed slowly, Eli occupying himself with drawing and building elaborate structures from couch cushions, while Mara and Nora took turns watching the street through rain-streaked windows. Conversation light, but attention never fully relaxed. It was mid-afternoon, the rain finally beginning to taper into a fine mist, when Nora went suddenly still at the window, her posture shifting into something alert and predatory that made Mara's stomach drop. "Someone's at the edge of the property," Nora said quietly, already moving toward the door. "Stay inside with Eli. Lock this behind me." Mara's heart pounded as she pulled Eli close, guiding him toward the hallway away from the windows, watching through the narrow gap in the curtains as Nora crossed the yard with a controlled, purposeful stride, disappearing around the side of the house where the tree line bordered the property. Long minutes passed in tense silence, Eli sensing his mother's fear and pressing close against her side, without needing to be told why. When Nora returned, her expression was tight, but not alarmed in the way Mara had feared. "Gone," she said, stepping back inside and locking the door firmly behind her. Whoever it was didn't linger once they realized they'd been noticed, but it confirms they know exactly where you live, and they're testing how closely you're being watched. "What do we do now?" Mara asked, her voice tighter than she wanted it to be, aware of Eli listening carefully beside her. "I'm calling Kane," Nora said. "This can't wait any longer. It's time to bring you both somewhere more secure, at least until the council finishes negotiating a resolution." Kane arrived within the hour, his expression carrying a barely restrained fury that Mara had never seen from him before, though it gentled instantly the moment his eyes found Eli, safe and unharmed, despite the fear still visible on the boy's face. He crossed the room and pulled them both into a fierce embrace, holding on longer than any of his previous greetings, as though reassuring himself with his own hands that they were truly unharmed. "I'm taking you somewhere safer tonight," he said, pulling back just enough to look Mara directly in the eyes, his voice carrying an authority she hadn't heard from him before, steady and absolute. "The council has secured a location deeper within our protected territory, somewhere the Eastern faction cannot easily reach without triggering an immediate and unified response from every pack under my authority. I should have moved you there the moment I learned of the surveillance. I won't make that mistake again." Mara nodded, trusting the certainty in his voice completely, and within the hour they had packed what they needed, Eli clutching his carved wooden wolf tightly against his chest, as Kane guided them toward a waiting vehicle, Nora following close behind, both of them scanning the darkening tree line with sharp, watchful eyes, even as they moved quickly toward whatever safety lay ahead. As the vehicle pulled away from the only home Eli had ever known, Mara looked back once at the small house disappearing into the rain and gathering darkness, and felt, despite the fear still thrumming through her veins, a strange and steady certainty settling in alongside it. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, whatever confrontation was building toward its inevitable conclusion, she was no longer facing it alone, and neither was her son. They had Kane, and Nora, and an entire hidden world of loyal allies she was only beginning to understand, all of them now fully committed to protecting the small, precious family that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, become worth defending with everything they had. The protected compound deep within Kane's territory looked nothing like Mara had imagined when he first described it during the tense drive through darkening woods. Rather than some fortress bristling with obvious defenses, she found a cluster of well-built cabins arranged around a central lodge, nestled so naturally into the surrounding forest that it would have been nearly invisible to anyone not specifically searching for it. Smoke curled from several chimneys, and figures moved between the buildings, with the same alert, purposeful energy she had come to recognize in Nora, clearly members of Kane's pack going about coordinated business even at this late hour. "You'll be safe here," Kane said, guiding them toward the largest cabin near the center of the compound. "This is the heart of our territory. No one hostile gets close without a dozen warnings reaching me first." Eli, exhausted from the tension of the day and the long drive, had fallen asleep against Mara's shoulder, somewhere along the winding forest roads, and Kane carried him gently inside, settling him into a small bedroom that had clearly been prepared in advance, complete with a soft quilt and a nightlight shaped like a crescent moon. "You knew we might need this place," Mara said, watching Kane tuck the blanket carefully around her sleeping son. "I hoped we wouldn't," he admitted quietly. "But I've learned, the hard way, not to leave the people I love unprotected, simply because I hope for the best." The word love settled between them, spoken so naturally, it took a moment for either of them to register its weight, but neither took it back, both understanding by now that whatever careful distance had once existed between a desperate mother and a guarded stranger, had long since dissolved into something far deeper and more permanent. Once Eli was settled, Cain led Mara to the central lodge, where a gathering had already assembled, Victor and Nora among them, along with a dozen others Mara didn't recognize, each carrying the same alert, capable presence she had come to associate with Cain's inner circle. A large table dominated the room's center, covered with maps marking territory boundaries and notations Mara couldn't fully interpret. "The Eastern faction has grown bolder," Victor said, without preamble, as Cain and Mara entered, gesturing toward the map. "Surveillance near the human settlement has escalated to direct approach, which tells us they're testing our response time and resolve. If we don't answer decisively, they'll interpret hesitation as weakness, exactly the opening they've been waiting for." "What are our options?" Cain asked, his voice carrying the same steady authority Mara had glimpsed the night of their difficult conversation weeks earlier, an authority that seemed to settle more naturally into him with each passing day of renewed responsibility. "Diplomatic resolution remains possible," Victor said, "but only if they believe we're prepared to meet force with force if negotiation fails. A show of unified strength, coordinated across every pack in the territory, might be enough to convince their leadership that this confrontation isn't worth the cost." Nora leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning the map with focused intensity. "Or they escalate regardless, believing they've already gained enough advantage from the surveillance to justify direct action. We need to prepare for that possibility, as seriously as we prepare for the diplomatic path." The discussion continued for over an hour, strategies debated and refined, contingencies mapped out with a thoroughness that left Mara both reassured and unsettled, reassured by the evident competence surrounding her, unsettled by just how real and immediate the danger clearly was. She said little, understanding this was territory beyond her expertise, but she listened carefully, absorbing every detail, determined to understand as much as possible about the world now protecting her family. Near the end of the meeting, Cain turned to address the gathered pack leaders directly, his voice carrying a weight and clarity that silenced the room instantly. "5 years ago, I let fear and grief convince me that stepping back from leadership was the responsible choice. I was wrong. Fear like that doesn't protect anyone. It only creates space for exactly the kind of threat we're facing now. I'm reclaiming full authority over this territory, effective immediately, and I intend to lead the response to this threat personally, alongside every one of you." A murmur of approval moved through the gathered leaders, several of them exchanging looks that carried relief as much as determination, and Mara understood, watching the exchange, just how significant Cain's absence had been felt across this entire hidden world, and how deeply his return was being welcomed by those who had waited patiently for it. After the meeting dispersed, Cain found Mara standing near the lodge's large window, looking out at the dark tree line beyond the compound's careful boundaries. He came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, even without touching. "You heard all of that," he said quietly. "I understand, if it's overwhelming, everything moving so quickly." "I'm not overwhelmed," Mara said, turning to face him fully. "I'm proud of you, watching you step back into who you're meant to be. That's not overwhelming. It's remarkable." Something shifted in Cain's expression, gratitude, and something deeper, more vulnerable, passing across his features before he reached for her hand, holding it gently. "I couldn't have found my way back to this without you," he said. "Whatever happens next, I need you to know that. We'll face it together," Mara said, echoing the promise she had made weeks earlier in her own kitchen, a promise that felt even more solid now, tested and strengthened by everything that had happened since. "Whatever comes, Cain, together." Outside, beyond the careful boundaries of the protected compound, the Eastern faction continued their calculated approach, patient and methodical, unaware that the man they had hoped to catch, weakened and isolated, had instead reclaimed the full weight of his authority, rallying every ally at his command, in preparation for whatever confrontation still lay ahead. Days passed inside the compound, in a rhythm that felt strange to Mara at first, equal parts confinement and unexpected community. Eli adjusted far more quickly than she did, delighted by the presence of other children among the pack families, several of them close to his age, all of them fascinated by the human boy, who could apparently sense things about the forest that most of them took entirely for granted. He returned each evening full of stories, about games played among the trees, about an older girl named Ivy, who had taught him to identify animal tracks, about a boy named Owen, who had shown him how to whistle in a way that echoed strangely through the woods. "They don't think I'm weird," Eli told Mara one evening, sitting cross-legged on his bed, while she read to him from a book Nora had found in the lodge's small library. "They think it's cool that I'm figuring out my wolf stuff, even though I'm not all the way like them yet." Mara's heart ached with a complicated mixture of gratitude and worry at her son's evident happiness, grateful that he had found such easy acceptance among these families, worried about the danger that had made this temporary refuge necessary in the first place. She kept those worries carefully hidden from Eli, determined to let him enjoy whatever normalcy he could find amid the tension surrounding the adults around him. For Mara herself, the days brought a different kind of adjustment, long conversations with Nora, and occasionally Victor, about the history and structure of the world she had stumbled into, careful lessons in understanding customs and expectations she had never needed to know before. She learned about the pack hierarchy, the delicate balance of territory and trust that held the wider community together, the weight of responsibility that came with Kane's position, responsibility he was clearly determined to shoulder fully now, no matter the personal cost. She saw less of Kane during daylight hours than she wanted, his time consumed by strategy sessions and diplomatic communications with neighboring territories, coordinating a unified response that required constant attention and careful negotiation. But each evening, without fail, he made time for her and Eli, sitting with them through dinner, listening to Eli's stories with genuine delight, and later, once the boy had gone to sleep, sharing quiet updates with Mara about how the wider situation was developing. "The diplomatic path is holding, for now," he told her one evening, exhaustion evident in the lines around his eyes, despite his effort to remain steady for her benefit. "The Eastern faction's leadership has agreed to a formal meeting, mediated by neutral territories, to discuss resolution. It's not a guarantee of peace, but it's a step toward avoiding open conflict." "When is the meeting?" Mara asked. 3 days from now," Kane said. "I'll need to attend personally, along with Victor and several other pack leaders. It's a significant risk, gathering so much leadership in one place, but it's also our best chance at resolving this without further danger to you and Eli, or to anyone else caught between these territories." Mara reached for his hand across the small table where they sat, understanding the weight of what he was preparing to face, the courage required to walk directly into a negotiation with people who had already shown willingness to threaten his family in pursuit of their goals. "I'll be here when you get back," she said simply. "Whatever happens at that meeting, come back to us." "Always," Kane said again, the same steady promise he had offered weeks earlier, and Mara held on to it with everything she had, praying silently that the diplomatic path would hold, that whatever confrontation still loomed on the horizon might yet be resolved, without the kind of violence that had already cost Kane so much 5 years earlier, the kind of loss she couldn't bear to imagine touching their fragile, precious family now. The night before Kane's departure for the negotiation, Mara couldn't settle into sleep, her mind circling endlessly through everything that could go wrong, every worst possibility her imagination could conjure. She finally gave up trying and slipped out of her room, finding Kane still awake in the lodge's main hall, studying the territory maps by lamplight, his expression drawn with the particular exhaustion of a man carrying more weight than he wanted to admit. "You should be resting," she said softly, crossing the room to join him. "I know," Kane said, though he didn't stop studying the maps. "I keep running through every possible outcome of tomorrow's meeting, trying to anticipate what they might propose, what concessions I'm willing to make, where I need to hold firm regardless of the cost." Mara settled into the chair beside him, watching the flicker of lamplight across his tired features. "Can I ask you something honest?" "Always." "Are you afraid," she asked, "of tomorrow, of everything this might cost?" Kane was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally looked up from the maps, his eyes carried a vulnerability she rarely saw from him, even after everything they had shared these past months. "Yes," he admitted. "I'm afraid of failing again, the way I failed 5 years ago. I'm afraid of what that failure might cost you and Eli, when the stakes feel even higher than they did before. because now I have so much more to lose." "You won't fail," Mara said, with a certainty that surprised even herself. "Not because failure isn't possible, but because you're not the same man who walked into that attack 5 years ago, unprepared and overconfident. You've spent 5 years learning caution, learning to weigh every choice carefully. That wisdom will serve you tomorrow, whatever happens." Kane reached for her hand, holding it with a gentleness that carried the full weight of everything unspoken between them. Gratitude and fear, and a love neither of them had needed to name aloud, because it had simply become undeniable, woven into every quiet moment they had shared since that first desperate night months ago. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said quietly, "I need you to know that meeting you and Eli was the best thing that's happened to me since long before the attack. You gave me a reason to become someone worth trusting with responsibility again. I won't ever be able to fully repay that." "You don't need to repay it," Mara said, echoing words she had spoken to him once before, in a different context, though the sentiment carried even more weight now. "Just come back to us. That's all the repayment I'll ever need." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the lamplight casting long shadows across the maps and papers scattered over the table. Two people who had found each other through crisis and built something steady and true in the months since, now facing the uncertain culmination of everything that had brought them together. When Kane finally rose to seek what little rest he could manage before the following day's journey, he pressed a soft, lingering kiss to Mara's forehead, a promise wordless but absolute, and left her sitting alone in the quiet lodge, praying to whatever powers might be listening, that tomorrow would bring resolution, rather than further danger to the fragile, precious family they had built together, against every reasonable expectation. Kane departed at dawn, a small convoy of vehicles carrying him, Victor, and several trusted pack leaders, toward the neutral territory, where the negotiation had been arranged. Mara spent the day in restless distraction, unable to focus on anything for long, her attention constantly drifting toward the window, toward the road that had carried Kane away, toward the silent phone she kept close at hand, waiting for any update. Nora stayed close throughout the day, her usual sharp focus softened into something more comforting, clearly aware of how difficult the waiting was proving for Mara. "He's prepared for this," she said, during one of the quieter moments, both of them sitting on the lodge's porch while Eli played nearby with Ivy and Owen. Kane was always skilled at negotiation, even before the attack. That part of him never disappeared, even during the years he doubted everything else about himself. "I know," Mara said. "I just can't stop thinking about everything that could go wrong." "That's fair," Nora said honestly. "But worrying won't change the outcome. Trust him. He's earned that, especially these past months." The afternoon stretched into evening without word, and Mara's anxiety grew sharper with each passing hour, until finally, just as the sky began deepening into twilight, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. She answered so quickly she nearly dropped it, relief flooding through her at the sound of Kane's voice, though something in his tone immediately told her the news wasn't entirely good. "The negotiation didn't go as planned," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "Their leadership arrived with demands far beyond anything reasonable, essentially requiring us to cede significant territory in exchange for standing down the surveillance and threats against you and Eli. We couldn't accept those terms without setting a precedent that would invite endless future aggression." "So what happens now?" Mara asked, fear tightening around her chest. "We're regrouping," Kane said. "The council is meeting tonight to determine our next steps. I won't lie to you, Mara. This raises the likelihood of direct confrontation significantly. I'm coming back to the compound tonight to prepare, and I need you to trust me completely with whatever decisions come next." "I trust you," Mara said immediately, meaning it despite the fear coiling tighter in her stomach with every word. "Just come back safely." Kane returned to the compound well after dark, his expression grim but resolute, and the following days brought a shift in atmosphere throughout the entire community, preparation replacing the cautious waiting that had defined the previous weeks. Pack members moved with renewed urgency, coordinating patrols along territory boundaries, strengthening the compound's careful defenses, and Mara found herself drawn increasingly into these preparations, no longer content to simply wait on the sidelines, while others determined the fate of her family. "I want to help," she told Kane one evening, finding him alone in the lodge's map room, studying territory boundaries with the same intense focus he'd carried since returning from the failed negotiation. I know I can't fight the way your people can, but there must be something useful I can contribute. Cain looked up at her, something complicated in his expression, protective instinct warring visibly with respect for her determination. You already contribute more than you realize, he said. Your presence, Eli's safety, that's what all of this preparation exists to protect. But if you truly want to help, there is something. The Eastern faction doesn't fully understand human involvement in situations like this. Your perspective, understanding how they might try to exploit vulnerabilities specific to you and Eli, could help us anticipate their next move. Mara sat down beside him, studying the maps with fresh attention, and for the next hour, they worked together, Cain explaining pack strategy and territory, while Mara offered insight into how a hostile force unfamiliar with human behavior might attempt to exploit weaknesses in their preparations. Practical considerations about school schedules and routine patterns that pack members, accustomed to their own more fluid way of living, might not have fully considered. It was late into that same night, the compound settling into its usual careful quiet, when the first alarm sounded. The sound tore through the darkness with jarring urgency. A deep horn blast, that Mara had learned during her weeks at the compound, signified immediate threat, and she was on her feet instantly, heart slamming against her ribs, already moving toward Eli's room before conscious thought fully caught up with instinct. Cain was faster, reaching the boy's door just ahead of her, scooping the sleepy, confused child into his arms with practiced speed. What's happening? Mara demanded, following close behind as Cain moved swiftly toward the lodge's reinforced central room, a space she had noticed before, but never fully understood the purpose of, until this exact moment. Perimeter breach, Cain said, his voice tight with controlled urgency, settling Eli into the secured room, before turning back toward Mara, his eyes carrying a fierce, protective intensity that sent both fear and reassurance through her simultaneously. Stay here with him, lock this door behind me, and do not open it for anyone except myself, Nora, or Victor. Do you understand? Cain, Mara, please. His hands came up to frame her face, urgent and gentle all at once. I need to know you're both safe, so I can focus on handling this. Trust me. She nodded, throat too tight for words, and he pressed a swift, fierce kiss to her lips, before turning and disappearing back into the chaos building, beyond the reinforced room's heavy door. Mara locked it immediately behind him, as instructed, then pulled Eli close, both of them sitting huddled together on the small cot inside the secure space, listening to distant sounds of shouting and movement beyond the thick walls, sounds that made her blood run cold, with a fear more absolute than anything she had experienced since that first desperate night carrying her sick son through dark woods months earlier. Mom, I'm scared, Eli whispered, pressing close against her side. I know, baby, Mara said, holding him tightly, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the terror gripping her own chest. But Cain and Nora and everyone here are going to keep us safe. I need you to be brave, just a little longer. Outside the reinforced walls, the sounds of confrontation grew louder, and somewhere beneath the shouting and the chaos, Mara thought she heard something else entirely, a deep, resonant howl that seemed to shake the very air around the compound, primal and fierce, unlike anything she had heard before even during her months living at the edges of this hidden world. She held her son tighter, praying with everything she had that whatever confrontation was unfolding beyond that locked door would end with everyone she loved still standing, when it finally, mercifully, came to a close. The minutes crawled by with excruciating slowness, every distant sound outside the reinforced room sending fresh waves of fear through Mara's chest, though she worked hard to keep her expression calm for Eli's sake, humming softly and stroking his hair, the way she had done through countless ordinary bedtime routines, anchoring them both in something familiar, amid the terrifying uncertainty surrounding them. Eventually, the sounds of chaos began to shift, the shouting growing more distant, the ground no longer seeming to vibrate with whatever fierce confrontation had been unfolding nearby. Mara strained to identify any change in the pattern, uncertain whether the shift signaled resolution or simply a change in location, the danger moving elsewhere rather than ending entirely. A firm knock sounded at the door, 3 deliberate raps followed by a pause, then 2 more. A pattern Cain had taught her before he left, confirmation that it was safe to open. Mara's hands trembled as she unlocked the door, finding Nora on the other side, her clothing torn and disheveled, a shallow cut visible along one arm, but her expression carrying relief rather than continued alarm. "It's over," Nora said, stepping inside to check on both of them with quick, assessing eyes. "The breach has been contained. Several of the intruders were captured. The rest retreated once they realized they couldn't overwhelm our defenses. Is everyone all right? Is Kane?" "He's fine," Nora said quickly, understanding the fear behind the unfinished question. "A few injuries among our people. Nothing severe." Kane led the response personally. "He's finishing up securing the perimeter, but he'll be here soon." Relief flooded through Mara so intensely her knees nearly buckled, and she sank onto the small cot, pulling Eli close against her side, both of them finally allowing themselves to relax slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. It was nearly 20 minutes later when the door opened again, and Kane appeared, his clothing torn in several places, a healing scrape visible along his jaw, but otherwise unharmed, his eyes finding Mara and Eli immediately, relief evident in every line of his exhausted but steady expression. Eli launched himself off the cot and into Kane's arms the moment he entered, and Kane caught him easily, holding the boy close, with an intensity that spoke to how frightened he too had been during those chaotic minutes of confrontation. "You're safe," Kane murmured, more to himself than to either of them, before his eyes lifted to meet Mara's over Eli's head. "Both of you, that's all that matters." Later, once Eli had finally settled into an exhausted sleep despite the night's terror, curled up in Kane's own bed, rather than returning to his separate room, Mara and Kane sat together in the quiet aftermath, both processing the reality of how close danger had come to the family they had built. "Tell me what happened," Mara said. "All of it." Kane exhaled slowly, some of the careful composure he'd maintained for Eli's sake, finally slipping to reveal the full weight of what he'd faced. A small group from the Eastern faction attempted to breach the compound directly, likely hoping to reach you and Eli, while confusion provided cover. They underestimated how thoroughly we'd prepared, how quickly our people would respond. We contained the breach before they got anywhere near the central buildings, but it was closer than I'm comfortable admitting. "I heard something," Mara said carefully. "During the fighting, a sound I'd never heard before." Kane's expression grew more guarded, and for a moment, Mara thought he might deflect the question, but instead, he met her eyes directly, honesty winning out over careful protection. "You heard me," he said quietly, "in my other form. It's rarely something I let anyone outside the pack witness, especially not during confrontation, but tonight required every advantage I could bring to bear." Something in his tone carried an unspoken question, an anxiety about how she might react to this fuller understanding of what he truly was, and Mara reached for his hand, holding it firmly, wanting him to understand without any doubt that nothing about tonight had changed the fundamental trust and love she carried for him. "I'm not afraid of that part of you," she said. "I never have been. Not since that very first night, even before I understood what it meant. Whatever form you take, Kane, you're still the same man who saved my son's life, who has spent every day since proving how much you care for both of us. That doesn't change because of what I heard tonight." Kane's throat worked visibly, some deep well of emotion surfacing behind his careful control, and he pulled her close, holding her with a fierce gratitude that spoke louder than any words he could have offered. They stayed like that for a long while, drawing comfort from each other's presence after the terror of the night's confrontation, both understanding now, with absolute clarity, that whatever peace still needed to be secured, whatever final resolution still lay ahead with the Eastern faction, they would face it having proven, beyond any doubt, the depth and resilience of what they had built together. "This can't happen again," Kane said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "Tonight was too close. Tomorrow, I intend to end this properly, whatever that requires." Mara looked up at him, understanding the weight behind those words, the difficult choices still ahead, and found herself nodding, despite the fear still lingering in her chest. "Whatever you need to do," she said, "I trust you completely. Just promise me you'll come back to us, the same way you always have." "I promise," Kane said, and in the quiet aftermath of the night's terrifying confrontation, that simple, steady promise felt like the only certainty either of them needed to carry them through whatever difficult resolution still waited on the horizon. Morning arrived with a clarity that felt almost surreal after the chaos of the night before, sunlight filtering gently through the lodge's windows, as though nothing at all had disturbed the peace of the compound. Mara woke to find Eli already awake beside her, drawing quietly in a sketchbook Nora had given him, seemingly none the worse for the previous night's terror, his resilience once again striking her with quiet awe. "What are you drawing?" she asked, pressing a soft kiss to the top of his head. "Cain," Eli said simply, turning the sketchbook to show her a careful, earnest drawing of a wolf, standing protectively beside a smaller human figure, and a boy, rendered with the particular honesty children bring to their art, unfiltered by adult concerns about accuracy or subtlety. "He kept us safe last night. I want him to know I'm not scared of that part of him either." Mara's chest tightened with emotion at her son's simple, generous understanding, and she thought again of Cain's careful anxiety the previous night, his fear that revealing his full nature during the confrontation might change how they saw him. Watching Eli's easy, unhesitating acceptance, she understood that whatever fear Cain still carried about being fully known belonged entirely to his own history, his own grief, rather than to any judgment either she or Eli had ever actually held against him. They found Cain in the lodge's main hall, deep in discussion with Victor and several other pack leaders, maps and reports spread across the table, the atmosphere serious, but no longer carrying the frantic urgency of the previous night. Eli approached without hesitation, climbing into the chair beside Cain and presenting his drawing with quiet pride. Cain's expression shifted through surprise, then something deeply moved, as he studied the careful rendering of himself in wolf form standing guard over the family he had come to love. "This is remarkable," he said softly, his voice carrying an emotion that made Victor and the other pack leaders exchange quiet, understanding glances. "Thank you, Eli. I'll keep this always." The small moment of tenderness amid serious strategic planning seemed to shift something in the room's atmosphere, a reminder to everyone present of exactly what they were fighting to protect, and Victor cleared his throat gently before continuing the discussion, though his weathered expression carried a warmth that hadn't been there before Eli's interruption. "We've identified the group responsible for last night's breach," Victor said, once the strategic conversation resumed. "They retreated to a staging area just beyond our territory boundary, likely regrouping before another attempt, or waiting for further instructions from their leadership. This gives us a narrow window to act decisively before they reorganize." "What kind of action?" Mara asked, unable to keep herself from participating in the conversation, despite understanding this territory remained largely beyond her expertise. Cain looked at her, something resolute settling into his expression. "A direct approach. Rather than waiting for them to attempt another breach, we move first, presenting an overwhelming show of unified strength that makes clear any further aggression will carry consequences far beyond what their leadership is willing to accept. It's a calculated risk, but after last night, I'm not willing to simply wait for their next move." The room fell into focused planning after that, details of coordination and strategy that Mara mostly listened to rather than contributed toward, though she found herself increasingly impressed by the careful, thorough approach Cain brought to every decision, weighing risks and benefits with a wisdom that clearly reflected everything he had learned through 5 hard years of guilt and self-reflection, following his earlier failure. By midday, the plan had solidified, and preparations began in earnest throughout the compound, pack members readying themselves for what promised to be a decisive confrontation. Mara spent the afternoon trying to occupy Eli with quieter activities, though she could see her own tension reflected in the careful way she kept glancing toward the window, toward Cain's figure moving purposefully between preparations, toward the uncertain hours still stretching ahead before whatever resolution finally arrived. That evening, as the pack's coordinated forces prepared to move at first light, Cain found a quiet moment to sit with Mara and Eli one final time, the weight of the coming confrontation evident in his expression despite his effort to remain steady and reassuring for their sake. "Tomorrow will end this, one way or another," he said quietly, once Eli had finally succumbed to sleep, exhausted from the accumulated tension of the past days. "I need you to trust that everything I've learned, everything I've prepared, gives us the best possible chance at a resolution that keeps everyone safe." "I trust you," Mara said, and meant it with everything she had, though fear for his safety sat heavy and constant in her chest. "Just come back to us. Whatever tomorrow brings, come back." "I will," Cain said, pulling her close, holding her with a fierce tenderness that carried every unspoken promise between them. I have far too much to live for now, to let anything stop me from returning to this family, the one I never expected to find again, after everything I lost 5 years ago. They held each other in the quiet darkness of the lodge, drawing strength from each other's presence ahead of whatever difficult day awaited them, both understanding that tomorrow would finally bring resolution to the danger that had shadowed their carefully built happiness these past weeks. One way or another, for better or for the kind of loss, neither of them allowed themselves to fully imagine. Dawn broke gray and cold over the compound, mist clinging low among the trees, as Kane's coordinated forces prepared for departure. Mara stood on the lodge's porch with Eli beside her, watching the quiet, purposeful movement of pack members, readying themselves for whatever confrontation awaited at the territory boundary, and found herself struck by the solemn dignity of it all. Nothing like the chaotic violence she had half expected, but something more measured, more deliberate, an assembly of people determined to protect their community through strength, rather than seeking conflict for its own sake. Kane approached them one final time before departure, dressed simply, but carrying himself with an unmistakable authority that Mara had watched grow steadily over these past difficult weeks, the careful, guarded healer, transforming fully back into the leader his people had waited 5 long years to see return. "Stay close to Nora while I'm gone," he said, crouching to Eli's level first, resting a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "I need you to be brave for your mother today. Can you do that?" "I can," Eli said solemnly, though Mara could see the effort it cost him to keep his voice steady. "Will you come back tonight?" "I intend to," Kane said, "with everything I have." He rose and turned to Mara, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Everything that needed saying, already having passed between them, during countless quiet conversations these past weeks. Kane reached up to cup her face gently, and Mara leaned into the touch, memorizing the warmth of it, praying it wouldn't be the last time. "Come back to us," she said, the same words she had spoken so many times these past difficult weeks, words that had become something like a sacred promise between them. "Always," Kane said, and pressed a lingering kiss to her forehead before turning to join the assembled forces preparing for departure. Mara and Eli watched from the porch as the coordinated group moved out into the misty morning, disappearing gradually among the trees, until finally, even the sound of their departure faded into the quiet forest silence. Nora remained behind, along with a small contingent tasked with protecting the compound itself, and she settled beside Mara on the porch, both of them watching the empty tree line with matching expressions of controlled worry. "How long until we know something?" Mara asked. "It's hard to say," Nora admitted honestly. "Could be hours, could stretch into the evening, depending on how the confrontation unfolds. Kane will send word as soon as he's able." The day crawled forward with agonizing slowness, Mara trying to occupy herself and Eli with small tasks and distractions, though her attention remained constantly divided, ears straining for any sound of return, eyes drawn repeatedly toward the tree line where Kane and his forces had disappeared hours earlier. Eli, sensing his mother's tension despite her efforts to hide it, grew quiet and clingy as the day wore on, abandoning his usual play with Ivy and Owen, in favor of staying close beside Mara, both of them needing the comfort of each other's presence through the long, uncertain waiting. It was well into the afternoon, shadows beginning to lengthen across the compound, when a runner appeared at the tree line, moving swiftly toward the lodge with an urgency that sent Mara's heart into her throat. Nora was on her feet instantly, meeting the messenger halfway across the yard, and Mara watched their brief, tense exchange with growing dread, unable to hear the words but reading enough in their expressions to know something significant had happened. Nora turned back toward the porch, and for one terrible moment, Mara's mind conjured every worst possibility, but the expression on Nora's face, as she drew closer, carried relief rather than grief, and Mara's knees nearly buckled with the sudden release of tension. "They've reached a resolution," Nora said, slightly breathless from her hurried conversation with the messenger. The Eastern faction's leadership, faced with the full unified strength Kane assembled, agreed to stand down. There was a confrontation, brief but decisive, and our forces prevailed without significant losses on our side. Kane is unharmed. He's finishing negotiations for a lasting peace agreement now, but he sent word ahead specifically to reassure you both. The relief that flooded through Mara was so absolute, it left her momentarily unable to speak. tears springing unbidden to her eyes as Eli let out a whoop of joy beside her, throwing his arms around her waist in an exuberant hug that captured perfectly the release of tension they had both been carrying throughout the long, uncertain day. "He's coming home," Eli said, his voice bright with relief and excitement. "He's really coming home." "He is," Mara managed, laughing through the tears now streaming freely down her face, pulling her son close and holding him tightly, gratitude overwhelming every other emotion, as she allowed herself, finally, to believe that the danger which had shadowed their fragile happiness these past weeks had truly, finally, come to an end. Kane returned just as the sun began sinking toward the horizon, the coordinated forces filing back into the compound with the weary but satisfied bearing of people who had faced down a serious threat and emerged victorious. Mara spotted him immediately among the returning group, and she was moving before conscious thought fully caught up, crossing the yard at a near run with Eli close behind her, both of them colliding into Kane's waiting embrace with equal parts relief and joy. "You're really okay," Mara said, pulling back just enough to search his face, checking for any injury, despite the messenger's earlier reassurance. "I'm fine," Kane said, a tired but genuine smile breaking across his exhausted features. "It's over, Mara. Truly over. Their leadership has agreed to formal terms that include explicit protection guarantees for you and Eli, backed by the full authority of the regional council. This threat won't return." The words settled over Mara like a physical weight lifting free, weeks of accumulated fear and tension finally allowed to release, and she found herself laughing and crying simultaneously, overwhelmed by the sheer relief of finally, truly being safe. Eli, wedged happily between them in the embrace, looked up at Kane with open adoration. "I knew you'd come back," he said simply. "I told everyone you would." Kane's expression softened further at the boy's simple faith, and he crouched down to properly embrace him, holding on with the same fierce tenderness that had characterized every interaction between them since that very first difficult night, months earlier. "Your faith kept me steady out there," he said. "Thank you for believing in me." That evening, the compound celebrated with a warmth and joy that stood in stark contrast to the tense uncertainty of the preceding weeks. A communal gathering around the lodge's central hearth, food and stories shared freely among pack members, who had fought alongside each other, to protect not just Kane's chosen family, but the broader peace and safety of their entire territory. Mara found herself welcomed into the celebration with an ease that surprised her, pack members she barely knew offering warm congratulations and genuine gratitude, several of them thanking her directly for whatever role her presence had played in finally drawing their Alpha King back into the leadership role he had abandoned for 5 difficult years. "You brought him back to us," an older woman told Mara during the celebration, her weathered face carrying the same kind of respect Mara had seen from Victor since that first tense meeting in Kane's cabin. "We'd nearly given up hope that anything could reach him after what happened. You did what 5 years of council pressure couldn't manage." Mara accepted the gratitude with humble uncertainty, unsure she deserved quite so much credit for changes that ultimately belonged to Kane's own courage and growth, but understanding, too, the genuine relief and hope her presence in his life had clearly restored throughout this entire hidden community. Later, as the celebration wound down and Eli finally succumbed to exhausted sleep in Nora's careful company, Kane found Mara standing alone near the edge of the gathering, looking up at a sky finally clear of the storm clouds that had gathered so persistently these past difficult weeks, stars scattered brilliantly overhead. "I have something I want to ask you," Kane said, coming to stand beside her, something nervous, flickering beneath his usual steady composure. "Anything," Mara said, turning to face him fully. "These past months have taught me more than I ever expected to learn again," Kane said slowly, carefully choosing each word. "About trust, about courage, about what it truly means to protect something precious, rather than simply hiding from the fear of losing it. You and Eli gave me that lesson, and I don't want to spend another day pretending I could ever go back to the isolated life I was living, before you both found your way to my door." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, and Mara's breath caught as she recognized, in the starlight, the unmistakable shape of a ring, simple, but clearly carrying significance beyond its modest appearance. "I know this is significant, and perhaps sooner than either of us expected," Kane continued, his voice carrying a vulnerability that made the moment feel even more profound. But I've spent enough of my life waiting for certainty that never fully arrives. What I know, without any doubt, is that I want to build a future with you and Eli, openly and completely, as the family we've already become in every way that matters. Will you marry me, Mara? Tears filled Mara's eyes once again, though this time carrying nothing but overwhelming joy, and she found herself nodding before words could fully form, pulling Cain into an embrace that answered his question more completely than any spoken word could have managed. Yes, she finally managed, laughing through happy tears. Yes, Cain. 1,000 times yes. The news of their engagement spread through the compound with remarkable speed, and by the following morning, well wishes and warm congratulations greeted them at every turn. Pack members who had watched Cain's transformation over these past months, clearly overjoyed at this further confirmation of the happiness he had finally allowed himself to claim. Eli, upon waking to learn the news, responded with an enthusiasm that left no doubt about his own feelings on the matter. "Does this mean Cain is really my dad now?" he asked, practical and direct in the way children often are about matters adults tend to approach with more caution. Cain, present for the question, knelt down to address it seriously, understanding its weight despite Eli's casual phrasing. "If you want me to be, I would be honored to fill that role in your life," he said. "I already love you as though you were my own son, Eli. Whatever title feels right to you, that won't change." Eli considered this with the same serious thoughtfulness he brought to most important questions, before nodding decisively. "I want that," he said. "I want you to be my dad." The simple, direct declaration brought fresh tears to Mara's eyes, watching Cain's composure crack slightly under the weight of such open, generous love, from a child who had every reason to be cautious about trusting adults after his own father's absence, yet who had instead chosen, unreservedly, to welcome Cain into that role. Over the following days, as the immediate relief of resolved danger settled into a steadier, more permanent peace, Mara found herself increasingly drawn into conversations about what their future together might look like, practical questions of where they would live, how Eli's education might need to adjust to accommodate both his human schooling and his growing understanding of his own hidden heritage, how Mara herself might find her place within this community that had so warmly welcomed her. Victor, in particular, took time to speak with her about these matters, his weathered wisdom offering guidance that Mara found genuinely valuable as she navigated this significant transition in her understanding of the world and her place within it. "You've handled everything asked of you these past months with remarkable grace," Victor told her during one such conversation. "The council has taken note of that, Mara. Whatever role you choose to build for yourself within this community, know that you've already earned respect that many take years, sometimes decades, to establish." The words carried significant weight, and Mara found herself standing a little straighter in the days that followed, no longer simply the desperate mother who had stumbled into this hidden world seeking help for her sick son, but someone who had proven herself capable of navigating danger, uncertainty, and profound change with courage and steady resolve. Whatever challenges still lay ahead in building a life that bridged both the human and hidden worlds she now belonged to, Mara faced them with a confidence that had grown steadily throughout every difficult moment of these transformative past months, standing beside a partner who had rediscovered his own strength through the simple, powerful act of choosing to love and protect his family without reservation or fear. Winter settled fully over the territory in the weeks that followed, transforming the compound into a landscape of frost-covered branches and quiet, snow-muffled mornings, and with it came the practical work of planning both a wedding and a new life that would need to honor both the human world Mara had always known and the hidden world she and Eli now belonged to as well. The council, eager to formally welcome Mara into the community, had proposed a ceremony that would blend traditions from both worlds, and Mara found herself grateful for their thoughtful accommodation of everything unfamiliar she was still learning to navigate. Not everyone within the wider pack community greeted the engagement with unreserved enthusiasm, however. During a formal gathering held to introduce Mara more broadly to territory leaders beyond Cain's immediate circle, she encountered a pointed skepticism from several older pack members who clearly harbored doubts about a human joining so completely into their world, doubts rooted less in personal animosity than in generations of careful tradition designed to protect their community's secrecy and cohesion. "With respect," said an elderly woman named Faye, whose position among the Eastern Territories' more moderate leadership had earned her a seat at the gathering despite the recent conflict. "History has shown that unions between our kind and humans rarely proceed without complication. I mean no offense to you personally, but the Council's eagerness to embrace this union concerns those of us who remember previous difficulties." Mara felt the weight of dozens of watching eyes as she considered her response, understanding this moment carried significance beyond a simple social exchange, a genuine test of whether she could hold her own within a community still uncertain about her place in it. "I understand the caution," she said carefully. "I can't offer guarantees that our situation will unfold without any complication at all. But I can tell you that since the night I first carried my sick son through these woods seeking help, I have done everything I could to understand and respect this world, rather than simply demanding it accommodate mine. I hope, over time, that consistent effort will speak louder than any promise I could make today." A murmur moved through the gathered leaders at her measured, honest response, and Faye studied her for a long moment with an expression that shifted gradually from skepticism into something more thoughtful. "That is a wiser answer than most humans in your position manage," she said finally. "Perhaps there is more substance to you than mere circumstance brought you here." Kane, standing close beside Mara throughout the exchange, reached for her hand once the tension of the moment eased, pride evident in his expression, despite his effort to maintain appropriate composure during the formal gathering. Later, once the assembly had dispersed, he pulled her aside with visible relief. "You handled that beautifully," he said. "Faye's approval, even the grudging kind you just earned, carries significant weight among the Eastern Territories. That will matter greatly as we work to solidify lasting peace after everything that happened." "I meant what I said," Mara replied. "I don't expect this to be easy, but I'm not interested in easy. I'm interested in building something real, with you, with Eli, with this whole community that's become so unexpectedly important to me." Over the following weeks, Mara continued proving that commitment through countless small, deliberate choices, learning the customs and courtesies expected within pack gatherings, studying the careful history Victor shared with her about the delicate balance between human and hidden worlds, even beginning tentative lessons in understanding the physical language and instincts that Eli, as he grew older, would need guidance navigating as his own heritage continued developing. Slowly, gradually, the cautious skepticism she encountered from some corners of the community began softening into genuine acceptance, earned rather than simply granted, built on the same foundation of consistent trust and effort that had carried her and Kane through every difficult challenge since that very first desperate night. Eli, meanwhile, thrived within this expanding world in ways that filled Mara's heart with quiet joy each time she watched him. His friendship with Ivy and Owen deepened into genuine bond, and under careful, patient guidance from pack elders, he began learning more about the heritage that had once frightened him with its strangeness, now approaching it instead with the curious enthusiasm that had always characterized his relationship with anything new and interesting. He remained, at his core, entirely himself, cheerful and thoughtful and endlessly curious. But Mara watched him grow more confident with each passing week, more secure in an identity that blended both the ordinary human boy he had always been and the deeper heritage he was only beginning to fully understand. "I used to think the wolf dreams were scary," Eli told her one evening as they walked together through the snow-dusted paths near the compound, Kane, a comfortable presence beside them both. "Now I think they're kind of amazing, like I have a secret that makes me special." "You've always been special," Mara said, squeezing his mittened hand gently. "The wolf part is just one more piece of that, not the whole story." Eli grinned up at her, then at Kane, his expression bright with the particular happiness of a child who felt, finally and completely, secure in exactly who he was and where he belonged. Watching that happiness, Mara felt the last remaining traces of worry from these past turbulent months finally settle into something like peace, a quiet confidence that whatever challenges still lay ahead in building this unconventional but deeply loving family, they would face them together, with the same steady courage and devotion that had carried them safely through every difficulty since that first desperate walk through dark, unfamiliar woods. As winter began loosening its grip and the first signs of spring emerged along the territory's forest paths, preparations for the wedding accelerated into their final stages. Nora, who had appointed herself unofficial coordinator of the entire event, despite her usual preference for practical matters over ceremonial ones, threw herself into the planning, with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone who had known her only through her sharper, more guarded exterior. "I never expected to enjoy this kind of thing," she admitted to Mara one afternoon, both of them sorting through fabric samples for the ceremony's decorations, the lodge's main hall scattered with preparations for the celebration that would soon unite not just two people, but two worlds that had spent generations maintaining careful distance from each other. But watching Kane find this kind of happiness again, after everything, it makes even the fussy details feel worthwhile. Mara had grown genuinely close to Nora over these past months, their initial wary alliance deepening into real friendship, forged through shared danger and mutual respect. She valued Nora's honest, practical perspective, especially as the wedding approached, and Mara found herself occasionally overwhelmed by the weight of everything the ceremony represented. Not just a personal commitment to Kane, but a formal, permanent bridge between the ordinary human life she had always known and the hidden world she was now claiming as her own. "Are you nervous?" Nora asked, noticing Mara's distracted expression as she absently folded and refolded the same piece of fabric. "A little," Mara admitted. "Not about Kane, never about him, but about everything this represents. Becoming part of a community with so much history, so much tradition I'm still learning to understand. I don't want to disappoint anyone, especially not him." Nora set down the fabric she'd been examining and fixed Mara with a direct, serious look. "You won't disappoint him. I've watched you these past months, Mara. You've faced danger, uncertainty, an entirely unfamiliar world, all without losing yourself or backing away from any of it. That's not nothing. That's exactly the kind of strength this community needs more of, honestly, human or otherwise." The reassurance settled warmly in Mara's chest, and she found herself smiling despite the lingering nerves, grateful beyond words for the genuine friendship that had grown from such an unlikely beginning. A suspicious stranger transformed into one of her closest confidants, through months of shared trial and steady, earned trust. The wedding day itself arrived clear and bright, early spring sunlight filtering through the forest canopy, in dappled patterns across the clearing the pack had prepared for the ceremony. Wildflowers just beginning to bloom, scattered naturally throughout the space, in a display more beautiful than any elaborate decoration could have achieved. Mara stood at the edge of the clearing, dressed simply, but elegantly, in a gown that blended traditional human wedding style, with subtle touches Nora had insisted upon, small embroidered details representing elements of pack tradition, a thoughtful bridge between the two worlds she was formally joining together through this ceremony. Eli, dressed in a small suit that made him look simultaneously proud and slightly uncomfortable in the formal attire, waited beside her, tasked with the important responsibility of walking her down the natural aisle formed between rows of gathered pack members, and, remarkably, several familiar faces from her own ordinary human life, Ruth among them, having been quietly invited and briefed enough to understand the significance of the day, without revealing the full truth of the world she was witnessing. "Ready?" Eli asked, looking up at her with an expression of such earnest happiness that Mara's heart swelled with love for this remarkable boy, who had, through his own illness and near tragedy, unknowingly set in motion everything that had led to this beautiful, unexpected day. "Ready," Mara confirmed, taking his offered arm with a smile that couldn't have been suppressed even if she'd tried. They walked together down the flower-lined path, and Mara's eyes found Kane immediately, standing at the clearing's center, beneath an arch woven from living branches and early spring blooms. Dressed in formal attire that couldn't quite disguise the fierce protective strength that had always defined him, his expression carrying an open, unguarded joy that struck Mara with fresh wonder every time she witnessed it, still marveling at how far he had traveled from the careful, isolated man who had once hidden his true feelings behind guarded caution. The ceremony itself blended elements from both traditions, with a thoughtfulness that spoke to how deeply the entire community had embraced this union, Victor presiding with weathered dignity, incorporating both familiar human wedding customs and older pack traditions that spoke of loyalty, protection, and the sacred bond between chosen family members. When the moment came for vows, Kane's voice carried steady and clear across the gathered assembly, though Mara could hear the emotion trembling just beneath the careful composure. 5 years ago, I believed I had lost everything worth protecting, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. I convinced myself that isolation was the only responsible choice left to me, that I no longer deserved the kind of love and trust that comes with being fully known by another person. Then you walked out of the darkness carrying your sick son, asking nothing but help, and you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. A reason to believe I was still capable of protecting, of loving, of being worthy of the responsibility I'd once failed so completely. I promised to spend every day proving that faith was well placed, to you and to Eli, for as long as we both shall live. Mara's own vows followed, voice steady, despite the tears gathering in her eyes, speaking of gratitude and courage, and the unexpected gift of finding family in the most unlikely circumstances, of choosing, deliberately and completely, to build a life bridging two worlds rather than remaining confined to the safety of only one. When Victor finally pronounced them bound, formally and completely, the clearing erupted into joyful celebration, pack members and human guests alike sharing in the happiness of the moment, and Eli, unable to contain his excitement any longer, threw himself into the embrace of both his mother and his new father with an enthusiasm that drew warm laughter from the entire gathered assembly. "We're a real family now," Eli announced happily, pressed between them both. "Forever. Forever," Cain confirmed, lifting the boy easily into his arms, while keeping Mara close against his side, the three of them standing together at the center of a celebration that represented not just a personal union, but the beginning of a new chapter in the careful, historic balance between the hidden world Cain had been born to protect, and the ordinary human world that had given him back everything he thought he'd lost. The celebration continued long into the evening, tables laden with food prepared according to both human and pack traditions, laughter and music carrying warmly through the forest clearing, as guests from two previously separate worlds mingled with an ease that spoke to how thoroughly Cain and Mara's union had already begun bridging divides that had persisted for generations. Ruth, finding Mara during a quiet moment amid the festivities, embraced her warmly, tears of genuine happiness visible in her eyes. "I don't fully understand everything about this world you've stepped into," Ruth admitted, glancing around the clearing at the gathered assembly with open wonder. "But I understand happiness when I see it, Mara. And I have never seen you happier than you are today." "Thank you for coming," Mara said, genuinely touched by her old friend's presence and evident acceptance. However limited her understanding of the full truth remained. "It means more than you know, having a piece of my old life here to witness this new chapter." As the evening deepened and stars began emerging overhead, Cain found Mara during a rare quiet moment, away from the celebration's warm chaos, pulling her close for a slow, private dance beneath the darkening sky, away from the watchful eyes of guests still enjoying the reception's continued festivities. "Happy?" he asked softly, his forehead resting gently against hers as they swayed together to music drifting faintly from the clearing behind them. "More than I ever imagined possible," Mara said honestly. "When I carried Eli through those dark woods that first night, terrified and desperate, I never could have dreamed this is where that walk would eventually lead us." "Neither could I," Cain admitted. "I'd resigned myself to a lonely, guarded existence, convinced I'd forfeited any right to happiness like this. You proved me wrong in every possible way." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while, simply enjoying the quiet intimacy of the moment, before eventually returning to join the continued celebration, where Eli, having thoroughly exhausted himself with dancing and excitement, had finally succumbed to sleepy contentment in Nora's careful company, his small face still carrying a smile, even in sleep. As the celebration eventually wound toward its natural close, guests beginning to depart with warm final congratulations, Mara found herself standing at the edge of the clearing once more, looking back at the space where she had just formally bound her life to Cain's, to this entire hidden world that had once terrified her with its strangeness, and now felt, remarkably, like exactly where she belonged. Cain joined her, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders as they watched the last of the celebration's lights being extinguished, the clearing gradually returning to peaceful, moonlit quiet. "Ready to begin this new chapter?" he asked. "I've been ready since the moment I first walked through that door. Desperate and afraid," Mara said, leaning into his warmth. "I just didn't know yet what I was walking toward." They stood together a while longer, savoring the quiet peace of the moment, before finally turning to gather their sleeping son and make their way home, together, as the family they had built through courage, trust, and an unexpected love that had transformed both their lives so completely, carrying them forward into whatever future still awaited, certain now, whatever challenges arose, they would face them exactly as they had faced everything since that very first desperate night, together, unwavering, and bound by a love strong enough to bridge even the most unlikely of worlds. A year passed with the particular swiftness that seems to characterize truly happy seasons of life, each month bringing small, meaningful changes that gradually transformed the shape of Mara's new existence. The house Cain had built for them at the edge of the compound, close enough to the community for safety and connection, private enough for the quiet family life they had all come to cherish, became filled with the ordinary rhythms of a household that blended two worlds seamlessly into one. Eli, now approaching his 10th birthday, had grown into his heritage with a confidence that filled Mara with quiet pride every time she watched him. Under careful, patient guidance from pack elders, he had begun learning to embrace the fuller expression of his abilities, still human in every way that mattered most, but increasingly comfortable with the parts of himself that connected him to Cain's world as well. He remained close friends with Ivy and Owen, their bond deepening into the kind of childhood friendship that would likely last a lifetime, and he had recently begun asking thoughtful questions about someday taking on responsibilities within the pack himself, questions Cain answered with the same careful patience he brought to every aspect of raising the remarkable boy he now proudly called his son. Mara had found her own place within the community as well, her role gradually expanding beyond simply Cain's partner into something more substantial, a bridge between the human town nearby and the hidden pack territory, helping negotiate careful arrangements that allowed both worlds to coexist with greater understanding and cooperation than had existed in generations. Victor, in particular, had come to rely on her thoughtful perspective during council discussions, and even Faye, whose initial skepticism had once tested Mara's resolve so directly, had become an unexpected ally and mentor, sharing generations of pack wisdom that Mara absorbed with genuine gratitude and respect. On a warm evening in early summer, Mara stood on the porch of their home, watching Cain and Eli in the yard below, engaged in one of their frequent evening lessons, Cain patiently guiding the boy through exercises meant to help him understand and eventually control the fuller range of abilities his heritage would someday grant him. Eli's laughter carried clearly across the yard, bright and unguarded, and Cain's own expression, visible even from this distance, carried a warmth and contentment that had become so natural to him now that Mara sometimes found it hard to remember the guarded, isolated man she had first encountered on that desperate night, nearly 2 years earlier. "Dinner's ready," she called down to them, and watched as Eli abandoned the lesson immediately, in favor of racing toward the house, Cain following at a more measured pace, though his eyes carried the same eager warmth as their son's, at the prospect of an ordinary evening together as a family. Later that night, after Eli had finally settled into sleep and the house had quieted into its familiar evening peace, Mara and Cain sat together on the porch, watching stars emerge over the darkening tree line, a ritual they had maintained since their earliest days together, a quiet moment of connection at the close of each day, regardless of whatever challenges or joys that day had brought. "I received word from the Eastern Territories today," Cain mentioned, his tone carrying satisfaction rather than concern. "Faye has proposed a formal alliance, strengthening the peace we established after the conflict. She specifically credited your influence for helping demonstrate that cooperation between our territories, and between our worlds more broadly, could yield benefits beyond what either side previously imagined." "That's wonderful news," Mara said, genuine pride warming her chest, at this further confirmation of how thoroughly their unlikely union had helped reshape old patterns of division and suspicion into something more hopeful and connected. "It is," Cain agreed, reaching for her hand in the darkness. "None of it would have been possible without you, Mara. You didn't just save this family. You helped heal wounds this entire community had carried for generations, simply by refusing to let fear or unfamiliarity stop you from building something real." Mara leaned into him, savoring the warmth of his presence, the steady certainty of a partnership built through genuine trial and proven, unwavering devotion. She thought back, as she often did during these quiet evening moments, to that first, desperate night, carrying her sick son through dark, unfamiliar woods, terrified and uncertain, never imagining the extraordinary life that single act of courage would eventually lead her toward. "Do you ever think about how differently everything might have turned out?" she asked, "if I hadn't found the courage to walk out into those woods that night?" Cain considered the question seriously, as he considered most things, before answering. "I try not to dwell on it too deeply," he admitted, "but when I do, I think about how close I came to remaining lost in that isolation forever, convinced I no longer deserved happiness or connection. You saved more than Eli that night, Mara. You saved me too, even though neither of us understood that yet." "We saved each other," Mara corrected gently. "That's what I choose to believe. Two people, both carrying more fear and loneliness than either wanted to admit, finding exactly what the other needed most, completely by accident, or perhaps not by accident at all." Cain smiled at that, pulling her closer against his side as they continued watching the stars brighten overhead, the quiet peace of the evening settling comfortably around them both. Inside the house, their son slept soundly, secure in an identity that blended two worlds seamlessly, surrounded by a family built not through convention or expectation, but through courage, trust, and a willingness to embrace the unexpected, extraordinary connections life sometimes offers to those brave enough to reach for them. Whatever challenges the future still held, Mara knew, sitting there in the comfortable darkness beside the man who had once been a mysterious stranger, and had become, through months of shared trial and steadily deepening love, the truest partner she could have imagined, they would face them together, exactly as they had faced everything since that very first desperate night, when a frightened mother's plea for help had led, against every reasonable expectation, to the discovery of an entire hidden world, and within it, a love strong enough to bridge every difference and heal even the deepest wounds, transforming two broken, isolated lives into one complete and thriving family, bound together forever by the extraordinary courage it had taken to simply ask for help, and by the remarkable devotion that had answered that desperate call with everything it had to give.